She said Julie was going to have to respond. That's humor or something. Okay. And I didn't.
All right. We can ask that tonight. I call the meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the study session of the Ashland City Council. Today is Monday, May 19th, 2025. On our agenda this evening is Recology has come out to talk with us about the Consumer Price Index adjustments. We have the walkable design standards, code amendments, and the third quarter financial update.
Mayor, point of order.
Yes.
I'd like to move to add an item to the agenda.
Okay.
Discussion around process for electing our next appointed counselor and what that process might look like.
Is there a second? Oh, actually, we aren't allowed to do motions at study sessions. So I guess I'll just take a request. And that sounds fine to me. So we will add it on to the agenda. Since we have people here to present to us, let's add it to the end, and we'll make sure that we touch that through before we address it before we finish out.
Just a, I guess, question for staff in terms of what we're looking at on the agenda. I'm wondering if we could place this before or in between item number 3A and 4A, simply because I could see 3A and 4A potentially taking quite a bit of time, and I'm not sure about the time sensitivity to 3A, but I'm sure 4A could potentially wait given the time constraints that we have.
So 4A tonight, we need direction regarding the child care grants and some information about the reserve fund. So we will need to hit that topic tonight. I'm not sure, I believe walkable standards, we're on our deadline on that as well to go with CFA or...
Just because I know 3A
we have people to present.
is as
Okay.
long as it's completed before the transportation system plan is completed, we need to move forward with that. So
I do believe we have consultants online to present to us tonight, so.
Yeah, that's what I was going to note. There is not a deadline, as you indicated. This has to be done as part of the transportation system plan update. However, this is part also of a DLCD contract in which we've benefited from the work of Cascade consultants, our partners, and they are on the call this evening, and their scope of work does conclude. So if it was pushed, we would not necessarily have their presence to answer questions.
okay.
Great. We'll leave it then at the end of the evening. And since we have several agenda items, we will move through as quickly as we can. All right. So public forum. Alyssa, we have one sign up. Is that correct? Great. Thank you. So Debbie Nicewander. And Debbie, you'll go to that microphone. It should be on, and you'll see the clock now up on the upper right-hand side. You'll have 3 minutes, and you'll hear a chime at the 20-second mark, and then you'll still have 20 more seconds. Yeah, and go ahead and pull that microphone down nice and close to you so we can hear you. Does that sound? It sounds? Yep.
Okay, Debbie Nicewander, I'm here to talk about expulsion. And tonight I'm going to talk to you about the night-long expulsions. And I don't know how many city councilors are even aware that we have a night-long expulsions. So I've included in your packet a list of things that people on the night-long can be expelled for. Now, one of my main questions regarding this is, this came from administration, and it didn't come through city council like the ordinance that we're going to speak about tomorrow. And I have concerns about that. There was no input from council and no public knowledge put forth regarding what's going on the night long. Okay, the second page is the new rules for the dusk to dawn sleeping on. And this came out at the end of April, and they're really cracking down. If you're not off the lawn by 7:30 now, guess what? They'll take your stuff. If you go to get your stuff back, you're expelled. Okay, so they're really getting aggressive on expelling people from the only legal place to be. What's up with that? On the second page of that, there's also other rules besides getting off the lawn at 7:30. That's really the only one that they're actively enforcing right now. But I want you to look at the pet one. I got bit by a dog on the night lawn. It put me in the ER. It was severe. That person did get expelled for 30 days. They got cited. They're now back on the lawn. They're not even required to muzzle the dog. That dog has sent other people leaving the lawn because of the fear of the dog. The day before yesterday, these dogs went after another little itty bitty new dog and was dragging the lady across the lawn to get to the dog. Okay, this is definitely a problem, but we're not enforcing that. When I talked to an officer about it, he says if we start enforcing all the laws, guess what? There's a law saying no guests on the lawn, which means I can no longer come to the lawn. You know, if you all tell me, Deb, we don't want you on the lawn, hands up, I'll stay off. Okay, let's move along, 3 minutes is fixed. Okay. When I inquired about this expulsion ordinance, I was told they were going under Parks and Rec. Well, here's a map. This is part of facilities, not Parks and Rec. That is not a valid excuse to be able to deviate from the process. Okay, one more thing. Actually, two more, but hey, I gave you a copy of the municipal court scheduling and how they schedule. We can add something specifically for Elia. Tomorrow, we have municipal court, we have arraignments and pretrials. I invite anybody to come and sit down. This new judge and the staff right now are doing an awesome job. We're on top of it. Thank you.
Thank you. We are now to the Recology presentation.
If I remember correctly, I just press and then press again to stop. All right, thanks for having us. I know we only have 10 minutes, so we'll do everything we can to get a bunch of information to you here quickly. My name is Eric Onmark, Community Affairs Manager for Ecology Ashland. Next to me is Robert Long, our Assistant GM, and Chris Carey, our Senior GM out of Portland. So thanks for having us and giving us this opportunity to talk about the company, as well as continuing to provide services here in Ashland. We're going to breeze through some of the stuff because you know this information, but Recology is an integrated resource recovery company, West Coast born and bred, largest employee-owned company in this industry. 39 local employee owners here in the Rogue Valley. The focus of this slide we want to talk about is our emphasis on recovery and something that differentiates us from our industry peers here in Southern Oregon. Here in Ashland, we have a few different lines of business. We have our collection company, which, assuming everyone is familiar with, the white, blue, and green trucks picking up materials from the curbside, the Ashland Recycling Center, as well as the Valley View Transfer Station. We provide services in Ashland Talent, southern third of Jackson County. A lot of resources that we rely on to be efficient here locally are provided out of our regional office, as well as our corporate office.
All right. What makes Recology a great place to work? We're employee owned. Everyone owns a share of the company. We're not publicly traded. We offer competitive wages, educational assistance. We promote from within the company, which in turn we feel correlates to the low turnover. 16 years as Recology Ashland. We're not just garbage truck drivers here. We're mechanics, operators, environmental science teams, P&C. We also not only have a local customer support center, but we have bilingual team members there as well to help with our Spanish-speaking communities. This is a really cool slide that we're all really proud of, and hopefully you guys are too. This is Michael Gunter. He's been a resident, born, raised, and still lives here currently in Ashland. He was just recently recognized by a National Waste Recycling Association as Driver of the Year. It's a nationwide competition. Over 140,000 applicants applied to that. This is a Ashland first, so really, really proud of that.
We offer a very expansive list of programs here that you're going to likely only find in a very large metropolitan area, but we do it here in Southern Oregon. We have a recycling list that is more expansive than any other company in the region. We have curbside glass collection, which is something you don't see that often. Mattress recycling that we began 3 years ago. 70,000 mattresses since 23 translates to about 50 semi-trucks of mattresses that we've kept out of the landfill over the last few years. Battery recycling. This is something that we launched this past year through Call to Recycle, another first in the region. Paper shred recycling with our largest waste generator in town, local bookmaker. Pedal Power RVTD, our partnership with Mike Vergeer, where we're keeping bikes out of the landfill and out of the scrap pile and getting those back to people in the community. Even ink cartridges and our retired collection carts after 10 to 20 years. Those things need to be disassembled and sent on for recycling. We do not landfill them. We do pack them up, disassemble them, and get them to be recycled. We're also going a new and exciting direction, or hoping to relatively soon, with respect to food scrap composting. This is something that we know has been an interest for a lot of people here in the community. We don't have the availability at this moment to take food scraps to our local composting facility that is run by another company here locally. What we're looking at, though our North Star is still going to be a curbside collection program that includes food scraps akin to Portland, San Francisco, elsewhere. What we're looking at in the meantime is a pilot that's going to be able to get us to offer this program to our customers. We're envisioning a program that would be a customer drop-off. These are 2 units we've been looking at. We have quotes. We've done a lot of exploration. We're developing operations plans. Still have some internal discussions that need to happen, but these are solutions that we're really trying to solve and to bring this service here and really just continue to expand what we're doing on the front of resource recovery. And in addition to that, we're more than just picking up trash, recycling, and organics. Education and outreach. Again, our local customer service center, if you call us, someone on Oak Street is picking up that phone. Special material drop-off events, including yesterday's spring clean, where I got a little too much sun on my scalp. In-kind and financial sponsorships here in town, organizations that we're supporting. Chamber and committee leadership, R99, which is renewable diesel fuel in all of our assets. Our staffed recycling center, which will have a donation drop-off opportunity here in the near future. We're working on goodwill to close that deal, as well as our Adopt a Park and Adopt a Highway volunteer programs that we're active in here in Ashland.
All right, so with the proposed 5.75% increase for a residential 32-gallon customer, monthly that equates to $24.90, $1.43 additional. What's driving this cost is partly 30% of it is disposal. We do our best to set our rates every year, and we anticipate the cost that the landfill is going to charge us. The last 2 years it's been double, so we're playing a little bit of catch up there. Additionally, labor, we want to retain and continue to recruit the best talent possible. And team growth. Modernization and improvements, a lot of you made it out to the facilities to tour it and kind of see what we were talking about on that. We really appreciate the visit. You guys being able to see what we have. The ones that missed it, we'd still love to get you out there and give you a chance to see what we're talking about. But thank you.
This is our last slide, and really just kind of a summation of a number of the things that we talked about in terms of what you get here being a Recology customer. We're doing a lot of good things. We have a lot of good things going for us. The one exception being our proximity to the landfill. But with all those things we mentioned in those previous slides, with this price increase going into effect July 1st, the base charge for our customers would be 10 cents more per month. And if we have any time, we can answer some questions.
Questions? Councillor Dale?
Not a question, just more of a statement. I just wanted to say thank you guys so much. We were chatting briefly before the study session started about just the work that goes in behind the scenes and the kind of the things that we don't mean to as community members have taken things for granted. And I just appreciate all of the productive things that we can do because we're not doing what you guys do. And thank you very much for that.
No, thank you. And there's always an open invite to hop on a truck whenever you'd like. Just let me know.
Can I drive one?
Do you have a commercial driver's license?
I used to. Councillor Kaplan?
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, you guys. I just have a question about the composting pilot that you mentioned. You mentioned it's a drop-off service. Where are you thinking the drop-off service would be? Would this be at the waste at the recycling center, or would it be? Are you thinking would have to be up at the transfer station?
The drop-off location would almost certainly be the recycling center, the proximity to downtown, and just continue to add value to that facility. The physical placement of the unit, that's the one on the right, would almost certainly have to be at the transfer station. That's put in an open top debris or a closed top debris box. The eco-rich unit, I'd love to have it down there. As you know, that's city property. So those are, discussions that we can have, meaning at the recycling center. But that one would either be located at either location, but the drop-off itself would be ideally at the Ashland Recycling Center. We could look at Valley View as a second drop-off site as well.
A plug for one additional. Sorry, Mayor.
Go ahead.
Yeah. One additional plug for it being at the recycle center is the cost of electricity is a lot cheaper than it would be up at the transfer station.
And cleaner electricity
And
as
cleaner
well.
electricity, so-
If it has three-phase power, that's going to be the biggest benefit. I've already started some discussions with Chad with the city. So.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And just one more. Did you want to talk about the waste audit that is going to happen on June 16th, and some of us are going to help you with?
We can, yeah. No, really quick. We're doing the first ever Ashland citywide waste characterization, June 16th through 20th. I'll be leading it. We're going to be looking at samplings of the residential and commercial waste stream in order to get some more actionable data. So that we can better understand the waste stream here in Ashland, and ideally get some information to help, work towards, better diversion, better recycling. Where are the holes in understanding? How can we better educate the population of the city? So anyone who wants to get dirty, we'll be taking volunteers.
I'm hoping to get my mom out there with us.
Councillor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you. No, I appreciate all the work that you all do, and the site visit was phenomenal. I've got a little 4-year-old that wants to work in waste management now, and I think as long as he's working for a company like yours, that sounds fantastic. Because you're just incredible in the fact that you're employee owned. I just want to point out the comparative analysis on I guess it's the next slide now. It really stood out to me when you gave this presentation to us when we did the site visit. And I think it's important for people to understand the value that they get with Recology. And you can see all the green check marks. And really the only thing against you is the proximity to landfill. And there's not much we can do about that. So really for being 10 cents above what Medford Phoenix is, I think that this is completely reasonable. And I look forward to supporting this when it comes forward to council at the next business meeting.
Thank you.
Councillor Hanson?
Well, thank you all for coming. I mean, we really appreciate the service in town. Our town is so clean, in part by just your consistency and regularity. And on the commercial side of things, our business really appreciates your flexibility from the drivers. I mean, the drivers are awesome, and customer service. When we get hit hard and we need an emergency, unloading or whatever we call it, you're there to help. So thank you for that. And my question really is just about like the CPI and the price increase. It's very reasonable, and I'm just curious what your business structure is like. Do you isolate that on contract to contract, or are you able to spread it out over these different locations so it's not as impactful to some communities as other? If you could speak to that, because it's expected and reasonable.
Yeah, it's an allocation since we take our equipment and use it all three jurisdictions. It's tough to try to put one truck in one jurisdiction and one employee. So, and it's less efficient that way. So what you'll see is our pricing and our pricing structure is allocated across all three of our businesses, and it's allotted by customer count essentially for the most part.
Okay.
Yep.
So it seems like, and it feels like our community benefits from its relations to our neighbors too by keeping costs down.
Absolutely, and that's when that earlier slide talking about the three areas we provide service: Ashland, Talent, and Jackson County. Southern third of Jackson County, we end service at North Talent, and that's where rogue disposal begins. And that sharing, ultimately, that's where the efficiency in service is.
All right. Well, we all appreciate it. Thank you.
Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation. I know you do a great job. I do not want to get dirty, but thanks for the invitation. And I had a question, kind of piggybacking on Councillor Kaplan about the composting and where that's going to be located. And you said it was like the North Star. Do you know when that might be implemented, or?
Yeah, so the North Star I mentioned was really more of a curbside program. So that would be, a yard waste cart that you can put your food scraps in. That's what we're shooting for. That's something that we would like to do that aligns more with the ethos of this company. If I had an hour, I'd tell you all more about our composting side of the business. But back to the initial slide, that's what we do. We're a recycler and a composter, actually the largest commercial composter on the West Coast. We just don't have a commercial compost facility nearby, and that's been kind of what we've been hamstrung by. It's hard to get a date on that, only because we're talking about large volumes. We would either need one of a couple things to happen. It would need to be a regional compost facility here in the Rogue Valley that would be willing to take food scraps, and right now we don't have that. Or another facility that would be large enough and permitted enough and have the capacity to take that material. Those are the kinds of things that we're waiting on. There is some grant funding out there. There is a state bill going through right now that's looking at expanding compost infrastructure. In the meantime, this is our solution, meaning the pilots, to at least offer something to Ashland residents to be able to improve their environmental ethic and ultimately compost their food scraps.
Let me add to that really quickly too. So it's a great question, but we want to turn around and make an ask of you to help support a program like this. We'd love for you to go talk to your counterparts in Bedford and Jackson County to talk to them about a food waste program, because that'll be the impetus for the folks at the landfill where they have a yard waste program, but they need to incorporate some other pieces to that to take on a type 3 food waste, which is a residential collection or a commercial collection. So that would be helpful for us because we've been telling them. But it's nice to be able to, for you guys to have those conversations as well. That'd be great. And I forgot what other thing I was going to say, but essentially, I know what I was going to say. In order to make it efficient and less expensive, we'd also look potentially for talent to do this as well. So those are some folks, and they may be interested in it as well. But larger numbers across our current customer count makes it cheaper, right? More folks paying.
So Mayor.
Yes.
So if I understand correctly, looking more regionally to be able to make it happen, correct?
Yeah. Composting is really a numbers game. It's a volume game. So Ashland by itself, the volumes of green waste and food we collect here don't necessarily warrant a brand new compost facility just for Ashland.
Yeah, but
it needs to be more of a regional approach, which is why it would make much more sense to get others in the Rogue Valley wanting this. And then the provider that has the facility would be able to build.
A pilot helps, right? So if we can get this started and show that there's interest, we can help with that push as well.
Yeah.
So we have a keen interest in making this work.
Yeah, food waste is like way up there when it comes time to greenhouse emissions, so it would be good to be able to do that. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah. Well, it looks like that is all of our questions. Thank you so much for presenting to us, and thank you for your partnership in the community. I know yesterday there were cars lined all the way down the road, and you all were moving people through really quickly with the volunteers that were out there, and knowing that we can call you and have conversations about the things that we need and continue on the partnership is a really important part of the work that we do. So thank you so much for the approach you take to your work and for helping keep our community clean.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And so, Sabrina, we will see a resolution coming forward regarding these.
Yes, not tomorrow, but the next council meeting.
Yes. Okay, our next agenda item is walkable design standards, CFEC code amendments, and walkable design standards draft land use.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Brandon Goldman, Community Development Director. To my right, Derek Severson, Planning Manager, and most appropriately on this was also on the Technical Advisory Committee for the State of Oregon for walkable design standards. So Derek will be able to answer in concert with Jim Kimmel and Pauline Hardy, who are from Cascade Partners and who are available this evening and will be assisting the city in developing the code amendments that they're going to be presenting. And this was through a grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development in order to meet the state's climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. As part of this effort, Cascadia has completed a citywide code audit and developed draft walkable design standards, which were included in your packet, to ensure that new development supports safe, accessible, and pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods in keeping with the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. These walkability standards, as I just noted, are a requirement through the CFIC rules and must be adopted by the time Ashland updates its transportation system plan. Taking the advantage of looking at the required code updates, the consultants also are going to walk us through proposed amendments which highlight those changes that are mandated by the state, but also it was an opportunity to look at optional enhancements that the City Council could consider to further Ashland's efforts to further Ashland's livability goals. So the topics that we'll discuss tonight, and Pauline, I believe, is going to be leading that presentation, include window and weather protection requirements for commercial facades, design treatments for garages and driveways, residential entry standards and commercial zones, building orientation requirements. Essentially, this evening's study session is an opportunity where feedback that we receive from the City Council will assist us in creating the final package of code amendments that would be brought forward later this summer through formal public hearings before the Planning Commission and City Council. And with that, unless Derek has anything to add, we can turn it over to Cascadia.
Nothing to add. Great. Thank you so much. Really excited to be here tonight and get a chance to present on this topic to all of you. Look forward to your questions. So quickly, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Pauline Rueg. I'm the project manager for this project, and I'm here with my associate, Jamin Kimmel, who's the principal in charge. We work for Cascadia Partners, which is a land use planning, urban design, code, and public engagement firm based in Portland, Oregon. And we also both were some of the primary staff for the recent DLCD model code project, which is really the underpinnings of this project for the city of Ashland. Here's what we're going to walk you through tonight. So I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the project and CFEC in general. We're going to share what we've heard through our stakeholder outreach and also our Planning Commission presentation back in February. And mostly we'd like to introduce to you the code concepts and lead a discussion with you all to get your feedback on the draft discussion code amendments that you have in front of you. The discussion is actually, it's not 3 minutes, sorry, that's an error. It's 30 minutes and it will be incorporated throughout. So I'll facilitate that. So what is climate-friendly and equitable communities? You're all aware of this larger set of rules, state rules, that are really intending to coordinate land use and transportation planning in the state of Oregon, really targeting those climate emissions, also looking at issues of equity. Now, there's many different aspects of those rules and the program itself. You might be familiar with parking reform related to minimum parking, updates to transportation system plans or TSPs, and then climate-friendly areas, which City of Ashland is currently in the process of designating and adopting an overlay zone for. We're looking at one specific aspect of these CFAC rules. So we're focused on 0330, which is relating to land use regulations. And so those portions of the rules require jurisdictions to regulate their land use to support compact, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use, land use development patterns. And so we've interpreted that through our project with DLCD as walkable design. And so I'll break that down for you a little bit more. But the rules in 0330 are related to land use regulations in the city of Ashland and in the other cities that must be consistent with these rules. And these rules must be consistent on or before major updates to the TSP, which, as you know, the city of Ashland is just embarking on. So that's the impetus for this project, which is looking at the city of Ashland zoning regulations for consistency with these 0330 rules. So what is walkable design? That's a really large topic to break it down. And so we always come first and foremost from a place of the human experience. So what is the type of places and aspects of place that would make someone want to walk instead of driving their car, want to bike or use a mobility device? And it really comes down to all these different relevant standards within the code related to how are the buildings oriented? What are the frontages? What types of development? What scale of development? What's the street pattern, the block sizes? How do people move through spaces and use spaces and access transit or walking options so that, again, they could do that rather than using a personal vehicle and having that climate emission impact. So for this project, when we're looking at what is walkable design, we turn to the Walkable Design Standards Guidebook, which we helped the state DLCD develop, and the city of Ashland was part of our technical advisory committee for that. And so we turn to this Walkable Design Standards Guidebook and the model code that's contained within it. And that is a benchmark that the state has set in terms of how can a jurisdiction meet the rules and demonstrate that they in fact do support walkable design through their land use regulation. So again, if you wanted to break it down in terms of what are those OARs, the state rules trying to achieve, it's those comfort, it's convenience, it's access, it's equitable access, it's the built environment, and it's really about changing your zoning code, which sets the rules for how land can be developed. So in this project, we started last year by looking at all of Title 18 and doing an extensive code audit where we looked at first identified all the relevant standards and then compared them to the OARs and to the model code and looked for consistency. Then, based on those findings, we identified initial concepts. We presented those to Planning Commission in February and had staff's input as well. Now we've translated those code audit and concept findings into draft code amendments. The draft discussion code amendments are what you have before you in your packet, and they're based on these concepts that we're going to walk you through tonight. We've also done a round of stakeholder engagement. I'm going to present some of those findings to you. And we have a set of engagement materials that have gone up on the website and through the social media feeds of the city and in the city's newsletter to introduce the concept of this project and the findings. So based on feedback and another round of staff review, we'll be putting together final code amendments, and we'll be leaving those with the city, as Brandon was mentioning, to walk through the formal hearing and adoption process following the conclusion of this project. So a couple of things to clarify about these rules and how they apply, sort of some guiding things to keep in mind. So the rules, there's a large set of rules, and so the 0330 rules are only specifically targeting development on the private lot. And I raise this because if you look at this image, there's a very large impact of the design and character of the public right-of-way on how walkable environment can be. However, within this project, we're only looking at the land use regulations applied to the private lot. And so that's something really important to keep in mind. There's only so much within this project, but this is why the land use regulations are really supposed to be updated in tandem with the TSP, which is really looking at that shaded area in this image so that they're thought about together in tandem. And I will note that our code audit did find those areas of overlap, and that was definitely a part of the thinking in the code audit. So the rules apply to a very large area, the entire area within an urban growth boundary within a jurisdiction. So the only exceptions are areas that have industrial or rural character, but otherwise we did an extensive look across the entire set of zoning regulations for all relevant zones. And I should clarify that the primary emphasis here or focus is on design standards. And so that means that we also looked at design standards that would underlay the newly designated CFA overlays. So these concepts are also relevant in those overlays. So they really, again, are supposed to work in concert with other parts of the state rules that relate to the CFAs, which are more looking at the permitted uses and density and scale of intensity in those overlays. So I just want to clarify the relationship between this project and the CFA project. So we did present our code audit findings and our initial concepts to the Planning Commission back in February. We had a short amount of time on their agenda, but I did want to share with you all some of their initial input for us. They strongly supported and were very interested in what our code audit findings were, and they agreed that where it was possible to go further than just being consistent, in fact, go above and beyond the rules, there was strong support for that idea. There was consideration raised and we were advised to keep in mind the cost that may come or be associated with adopting additional standards. So for every new design standard, it may cause cost either to the actual project itself, or, as I'll get into in a minute, just the additional design that's required and the process for having additional design standards that an applicant needs to go through. And there were some points raised about the existing character of Ashland and some parts that are really important to keep in mind. So, and that's a really important component of downtown. So being considerate of how new walkable design standards may be applied in those historic buildings. One commissioner wanted to raise a great point, which is, we tend to think in Portland about weather protection in terms of rain, but also it does provide shade from the sun, but that needs to be balanced with how much shade do you want to provide, because also there's a desire to be in that sun and take advantage of that great natural resource. We recently just completed a round of outreach to stakeholders. So we did 2 separate rounds of this, and I wanted to share with you some of the things that we're hearing back from folks. So we met with some local climate and transportation advocates, and we met with people from 2 local groups, and we shared with them background on the CFEC project and the type of concepts we were considering and presenting to the city. And then we got some of their feedback. So they wanted you all to think about the fact that it's not just the built environment that affects walkability, but also very much the green aspects and the trees that are so fundamental to the character of Ashland and also really create a great environment for walking. Related to that, any amendments that would potentially interact with or have a different intent than the solar orientation code standards, there was still really a lot of support around maintaining those solar orientation aspects. And so, for example, one thing we talked about was the entry standards and wanting to make sure that a building could be at such an angle that would be, to promote the solar orientation, that would be more important potentially than having a building oriented to the sidewalk directly fronting it. So some give and take there. And I think just a continued desire for Ashland to not rest on its laurels, but continue to do better and to go further to ensure that while the city today is very walkable, there's always more that could be done to be more accessible for all users and everyone.
Pauline,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, but did you want questions as we go through, or will you?
I'm going to pause in just 2 slides at a first point. So we'll pause just to cover this first material, and then we'll pause after each concept, if that's
Great.
okay.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So we also, the last set of stakeholders we met with were local developers and builders. We think it's really important for cities to consider the users, the most frequent users of the code when considering code amendments. So we shared with them the draft discussion amendments that you have in front of you and asked for some of their input and feedback. And I would say generally there was support, but there were some key themes that came up over and over that I want to highlight. So there's a strong feeling that continued code updates make it confusing and complicated. And the more that is asked in design standards and the more that design standards get updated, the more process and time that takes for developers or builders to understand what's actually being asked. The more it may require of them to redesign their projects, and that adds cost. And so again, there's a tension of trying to meet the city's larger housing goals or reduce the cost of development of that housing with asking development to go further and do more for walkability. And I think there was a really strong desire to make sure that any code amendments continue to maintain some flexibility and exceptions so that developers are able to really respond to those unique site constraints that may come up. So before I go any further, actually, let me cover this one last slide and then I'll pause for questions. So what we're going to walk you through tonight is based on our code audit and looking at all of Title 18, based on the input that we've heard from stakeholders and staff, we've identified areas of the code that are not currently consistent with Rule 0330. And those are the portions of your code that would be required to be updated as part of that TSP work that Brandon mentioned. We also identified standards that might be consistent with the rules, but not necessarily consistent with the model code that the state has released. And those areas represent an opportunity where the city could choose to go further. It's not required, but we identified potential concepts to go further. And so those are the concepts that we're gonna present to you tonight for your feedback. Before we dive into those, though, I've covered a lot of material, so just pause for any questions or clarifications that people would like.
Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, it's kind of a 2-part connected question here. What were the two, you said 2 local groups that were consulted. I'm wondering who those 2 local groups were outside of the developers?
Yes, we met with members of Southern Climate Action Now and Streets for Everyone through the Ashland Climate Collaborative.
Interesting. I'm curious if there's any written record of this feedback from the developers or from these 2 advocacy organizations, so that we could review what that, rather than the general sense was, if we could actually see what some of those concerns and what some of the proponents are arguing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The timing of the meetings was a little unfortunate in that we met with them after we submitted your packet materials, but we do have the notes from both of those sort of outreach meetings. I'd be happy to provide those to staff who can provide them to council.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Councilor Kaplan.
Thanks, Mayor. I guess I have a couple of questions that are perhaps more about the overall intent and effect of this exercise. I understand, the application of these walkable design standards, but much of what you've said suggests that it would apply. Much of Ashland is already built out. I'm talking about the areas that are not the climate-friendly areas. This is applicable to downtown commercial, but it's also, which makes a lot of sense to me. But then much of the residential zoning it's much of it is built out, and I don't know, I'm listening to you and thinking, how much scope is there to really apply any of these standards in that area anyway? There aren't, with just a few exceptions, there aren't new development there. So is the intention to apply it to existing development, or if there's a change in, if somebody tears down a house, would it have to be then applied to the new construction? And then just a more existential question perhaps is that I'm having a hard time getting my head around, and I know this is not applied to sidewalks, but it seems to me that the most important feature for walkable design is a sidewalk in the right of way, rather than whether there's enough windows in, a residential neighborhood where the houses are set back by 20 feet or whatever it may be. It just strikes me that is the applicability of this to all of those zones really on the table? Because some of the zones seem to me more sensible than other zones, and I know I read the background note saying that we don't want to have islands of walkability, which are the climate friendly areas, or downtown not climate friendly area but still walkable. It should be applied citywide, but it just strikes me as maybe a little bit of lending towards maybe a bit of an overreach. So I'm wondering, are you looking for guidance? Is it even on the table not applying this to all of the zones within the city? Or is this mandated by the state that this has to be applied to R1 zones, as well as commercial and higher density zones?
I'll take the first one, you can do the second one. Yeah, great. Actually, the first one, this is Jamie Kimmel. I'm principal in charge with Cascade Partners. The state rules are fairly clear that the rules apply to all residential and commercial areas throughout the city, sort of regardless of how much buildable or vacant land is in that area. And so they would apply to many places that would be largely currently built out, right, or mostly currently developed. There would be instances where it's a single lot that's being redeveloped that some of these standards would apply to. There are always little pockets of buildable land that's left, even if most of the buildable land has already been developed. But I would also say that as the city grows, if there are, I'm not too familiar with how much additional buildable land might be in your urban growth boundary, but not in the city today, or could be added to the urban growth boundary in the future. But those larger kind of greenfield development areas could be subject to these standards in the future as they come into the city. So yeah, the rules are pretty clear that it does need to apply citywide. The impact of these rules on places that are largely built out will be less, just simply because there'll be less development in those areas.
I think also I would add that the rules do include a pretty robust exemption provision, and that's something that's looked at. But yeah, it's a very complicated, given how much area within cities across the state is built out. Some in walkable patterns where it works, but some large areas of cities not in walkable patterns. And so this really is meant to be incremental. And in terms of the sidewalk, that's something we spent months and months thinking about and really breaking down what affects the experience and makes something walkable or not walkable. And I absolutely take your point. It's about the dimensions of that sidewalk. But I also think it's really critical how the buildings front the sidewalk, what the distance is, what's the interaction with the sidewalk, and really the environment is what makes someone want to walk in that space or not. So I think there's plenty of spaces throughout the country and internationally that have very subpar tiny sidewalks, or where you even walk in the road with cars, but they're incredibly walkable, interesting places to be. So I would argue in some ways that what happens along those sidewalks is every bit as important. And there's a lot of questions around scale and land use and the design of those buildings that really affect someone's experience and make them want to choose to walk.
Yes, if you can, let's do it quickly.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I heard you say that there was some concern about the historic buildings, that glass transparency requirements might be difficult in historic buildings. That suggests that there is some requirement that those things be changed. What is that referring to?
So I think it's a question of, as we're looking at the code standards, we have to think carefully about the applicability, and if a use were to change or be redeveloped, how do these new standards apply? So exactly to the core of your question, if large portions of the city are built out and now you increase the design standard ask of a new project, how does that affect potential? And so I think that's something that we're looking at, trying to balance this tension in how far can you go in a code concept or a code amendment change to get to these placemaking ideas while being cognizant of the impacts on development feasibility.
Let me be actually clear though, these are still land use regulations, and so they apply when a property owner chooses to take an action on their property. These are not directives that a property owner must upgrade a building, change a facade, anything like that. These are the regulations that apply if that property owner decides to change that facade, to redevelop the building, to make a modification, then these standards would be applicable. Otherwise, these are not requirements that any changes be made to any properties.
Thank you.
Great. Councilor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a quick question. Thank you. So I see there on the slide here that if it's not, if Title 18 is not consistent with 330, then we've got to. But as you said, if it's not consistent with the model code, that it may. I'm confused. Help me understand kind of the order of which we're doing things here. We're here to solicit feedback from council, as I see. In fact, some of the questions I couldn't tell you what's right or wrong relative to number of eaves or shade or something like that. But what I'm curious about is we've got part of the packet was a draft ordinance with all of these amendments. So what I'm curious to know is all of the changes that are in that document before council has provided feedback, are these all, everything that we're looking at that's highlighted, are those the minimum required things that must be done, or does this draft ordinance amendment also include optional enhancements or anything that's above and beyond the rules based on feedback and research that you've already done? I just want to know what's a have to and what is a may do, and why do we have a draft ordinance already that has this?
Thank you. That's a great question, which I do not believe was made clear at all. So I really appreciate that question. What you see before you in the draft discussion is the must plus the may. So it's a full set of potential changes for the city to consider. And we'll walk through in the slides to come for concepts and be really clear about what's a must, which is that minimum, and what is additional things to consider.
Follow-up, yes.
Just a quick follow-up, and maybe just a statement for Brandon and Derek that I'll try to keep track of these, but I sure would like a document that actually clearly delineates what's a must and what's a may.
Yeah, we've indicated that we will prepare a matrix that separates the code amendments that are obligatory and those that are optional.
Great, thank you. Councilor Kaplan?
Or maybe rather than a matrix is, some people think a matrix and can be very helpful, but I would suggest two different shades of highlighting, maybe a yellow highlights must and a green highlight may or something.
It's a good suggestion.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's carry on.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, so, and I do want to state up front here, we're going to walk you through the code concepts, which are for changes to consider. But many, and really the majority of our code audit findings were that the city of Ashland is consistent in almost all relevant land use standards with the OARs. And not just consistent, but really goes above and beyond, which is, I think, something to be very proud of, because we looked at relevant jurisdictions across the state and nationwide, and a lot of best practices can be found right in your own city code. And so what you're not going to see here, or what I'm not covering tonight, is that things are already doing really well, but I do just want to highlight that there's a lot of aspects of walkability in terms of connected neighborhoods and block sizes, where really the city is already going above and beyond what's required by the state. So I do want to highlight that for you all. So I'm going to walk you through 4 concepts tonight. I'm going to cover the first 2, and then we're going to pause for questions and discussion, and then I'll walk you through each of the other ones and pause. So we're going to walk through 4 concepts, which are applying more design standards to single family and duplex uses, reducing the visual prominence of garages, requiring ground floor residential uses to be pedestrian oriented and activate the sidewalk, and requiring more windows and weather protection for commercial uses. So those are 4 concepts to consider. For each set of concepts, there's going to be 2 slides. There's an image of what is a possible built outcome today if there were not code changes made. And then you can see here we've highlighted the must-haves and the nice-to-haves. So the first slide is going to explain the big idea and what the code audit findings are. And then the second slide is going to walk you through the code amendments that you see in front of you and pose a couple of questions to tease out some of the policy priorities of council. So with that being said, let's dive into the first concept. So applying more design standards to single family houses and duplexes. So in residential zones, the concept would be to apply additional standards. So in the OARs, one of the rules requires residential zones to promote sociable development patterns. And so we've interpreted that to be related to the orientation of buildings, entries, where's the entry, how does someone engage with that building as they walk by it, right? Again, that notion of opportunities to stop, talk, get to know your neighbors, get to know people walking by and have those types of social interactions. So we're looking at entrances. We found in the code audit that Title 18 does not apply standards currently requiring entrances to be facing or oriented to the street in your residential zones. Going above and beyond, there are no transparency standards in those residential zones applied to single family and duplex uses that would require some minimum amount of transparency, which would have a minimum amount of windows and doors with windows facing the street, so that you would see something not like this project that we're seeing here on the left, where there's really not as much of a sense of engagement and interaction between the building and people walking by it. So that's the concept. The code amendments that you have in front of you are a requirement of a minimum of 50% of the ground level facade would be transparent, and we have specific, clear, and objective standards because these are residential uses. So there's a requirement from the state to have clear and objective standards apply to them. So any building within 30 feet of a street lot line would need to meet this minimum transparency on the ground floor. And our questions are 15%, does that seem like an adequate amount of transparency? And remember, the 15% transparency, that's you could choose. That's not a requirement. So I think really the bigger question is, what are the council's policy around wanting to use transparency to address walkable design? And I do want to note that there have been some questions raised around cost impacts and with more windows, also the energy efficiency. There's some interaction there. So really no questions related to the entry orientation because that's a must. Really the questions are related to the concept of applying transparency or not. And then let me just quickly cover the second relevant concept here. Which is reducing the visual prominence of garages. So I do want to be clear that there's several zones, special districts now within Ashland that already have some standards related to this. But what we found in the code audit is in residential zones, there were no standards that limit the width of the garage as a proportion of the overall building facade. So the garage could really be the prominent aspect of the entire building, really what people experience as they walk by. And there were also not standards that required the garage to be set back from the front facade, which means that you can have home designs where the garage actually extends out in front. And so what we have found based on our interpretation of the OARs is that this is not a type of built outcome that promotes walkable design. It's really a prominent visual garage, and also safety concerns. You know, I think about walking by down the sidewalk with one of my kids riding their bike ahead of me. So really some safety concerns in terms of walkability. So the must-have would be limiting the width of the garage, and then requiring the garages, and I'm going to get to this, that requiring garages either to be flush with the front of the facade or potentially set back. And then the city could choose to additionally apply setbacks to garages that are more than 2 cars, to require any 3rd or 4th car garage door to be set back. So to set that back so it's not a even larger wall of garages. So looking at what does that mean, I think here's the options that the city can look at in considering these concepts. So the city could choose to require the garage to be recessed further from the front facade. As you can see in this image here, the garage is set back. It's not even or flush with that front porch. So that's going above and beyond. And also, like I was mentioning, that option for having an additional recess for 3rd or 4th car garage stalls. So it's a lot of detailed code. I'm going to pause there for any questions or comments and thoughts about these types of policy choices.
Great. Let's start with the transparency standards, since we went to those first. Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, it's kind of interconnected with the garage as well. I'm trying to understand what the reasoning or logic behind this, what are the benefits other than somebody that's walking by might find it more appealing. I mean, I just don't understand why we're getting in the business of regulating how someone wants to design their home, and then the fallout being that it's going to cost more, and the way I see it is prohibit development and further push us away from affordability. So I think broadly speaking, none of this makes sense. And I guess a question to speak to it, not to these specific ones, is what are the consequences if we don't adopt this? Any of it?
So I guess I could just start with the sort of rationale behind the transparency standard. The idea there in general is that is actually a little bit more about the impact of people being in the home, being able to view out into the street. So there's this idea of that more eyes on the street promotes that sense of it's a public space that is surveilled, right? That is visible, and that can make pedestrians, people walking, feel more comfortable than they otherwise would if they're walking next to a building that has all blank windows. That's the primary connection, I think, to walkability. There is also the benefit of just there's a sense of there's an activity which makes it more interesting. But I think the main benefit is that there's this sense of security and comfort that comes from it being a surveilled public space. So that's the connection there to walkability. I will say that there is certainly a potential cost impact here. It is fairly typical for cities to require something like 10 or 15 or 20% of a building facade to have windows if it's facing a public street, even for single family houses. So it's not an uncommon standard. Many cities have made this choice prior to these rules being in place because they saw some of the potential benefits of it. But it is a valid policy choice and consideration. And if you're concerned about the impact on the cost of development, about flexibility for different kinds of housing, that's useful input for us. So we can go back and think about that, about whether or not this standard would be a major barrier to development or a major issue. Yes. The question on what would happen if you don't implement any of these, there's sort of a process that would play out that would be after you update your transportation system plan, that the department would need to make findings that the city's code is not compliant with these set of rules, and there is there's not a direct sort of penalty that we can point to right now of what the state would do. I think the state would request that you make other changes and demonstrate that the code is consistent with the rules. If the city chooses not to do that over time, there I think could be other consequences. I don't want to speak out of turn too much of what those are because it's depends on a lot of factors. So
Interesting. Thank you.
Brandon, did you have any follow-on?
Just in terms of this being a requisite code change to accompany the transportation system plan, in the eventuality from, as he'd indicated, we had a final transportation system plan and we're looking to acknowledge that and incorporate it into our comprehensive plan. If the mandated code requirements were not met, it may be that not be approved. And I know a lot of grant funding through the state for transportation system improvements rely on the transportation system plan to demonstrate it's a capital improvement that's part of that project. So again, it's untested waters, but something that we hadn't considered not complying with the state law.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think that it's worth probing because the way that I see this is that there really isn't a built-in mechanism to enforce this on the city. I think it's quite frankly kind of beyond the pale that we would get into this level of essentially social engineering and trying to tell people, you know, how big of windows they need and what the width of a garage is. I mean, if somebody wants to build something, and especially if it's consistent with current code, I fear that this is going to have a serious effect on our ability to develop more in the city of Ashland, and that when we do get developers that are willing to follow these rules, that the costs are going to go up. And I think that it's not consistent with what it is we're trying to do here. And from what I hear from a lot of people in the community, it's the opposite. They want more development and they want it to be more affordable.
Councillor Kaplan.
Thanks, Mayor. So I wanted to probe a little bit because you mentioned that there's some opportunity for exclusions or waivers, or I don't remember what the right term is that you mentioned. Particularly when you go back to the previous slide, you know, I think about property that is developable, that is, you know, vacant lots at this point, and you know, this. Frequently, the best way to squeeze housing onto those lots is to orient them so they're not on the street. Multifamily housing that uses the depth of the lot to have several units together, and I can think of several places where that's happened, both many years ago and more recently in neighborhoods that I think are eminently walkable. The front doors are not facing the street, but there's easy access, interesting building facades and everything. So I'm wondering what are the exclusions or the exceptions that are allowable, and what's the process for getting them for any new development?
So the term that I was referring to was the exemptions, which would be, so I think that first there would be, as Jamin was pointing out, this would not be applied to existing development. But in terms of exemptions, it would be related to the city's current exemptions process, which is something that we can look at more closely with staff. I know that in Ashland, there's a lot of site constraints having to do with topography, but I think there would also, you could look at site constraints related to surrounding development. So really it would be a series of exemptions that staff could use so that in conditions where these, there would be an exception and this standard would not be required. But staff, feel free to add anything. Or
I think just one thing to add there is that the exemptions that Blaine's referring to is not the city requesting an exemption to the state rules. It would be on each individual applicant, applying to the city could apply for an exemption to a particular one of these design standards based on certain conditions that they meet on the site.
And in the process, could you speak to the process, or maybe Brandon speak to the process of how a developer would apply for that exemption?
We have a design exception process now built into the code where someone has to show that there's a reason generally unique to the site or the circumstance that requires an exception from the standards. And I would also note, these standards for entry orientation already apply in all multifamily zones with anything with more than 3 units on a property are subject to this standard now, as well as all commercial properties. So this is really only making the change to apply them to single-family accessory units and duplexes. The garage standards, driveway width standards that are being talked about are largely similar to what's in place in the North Mountain neighborhood now, that was adopted in '97, and much of what's being proposed is just translating that beyond the North Mountain neighborhood, which is the area that's been one of the more built out recently. So, I mean, these are not, for the most part, standards that our development community aren't familiar with already.
Councilor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, so I just to be clear, I completely understand the must-have versus the nice-to-have, and we certainly don't want to create a plan that we accidentally forget to include must-have. So completely understand. This question, though, that was asked was the nice-to-have and the transparency here. And just speaking for myself, I am woefully underqualified to understand. I couldn't walk by 10% versus 15% transparency if my life depended on it. So I guess my question is given that you've talked to developers, I think what I would need would be, is it possible to procure basically a list of all of the nice-to-haves where our group of developers that you've spoken to can speak to what the additional costs would be if we implemented these nice-to-haves, just so that we can balance that against what we're trying to do with affordable housing initiatives and make it easier for developers. I understand that for like exemptions, you might want to have exemptions built in the code for must-haves. I would be hesitant to add exemptions for nice-to-haves. I'd rather have it be the other way around, where they don't have to get an exemption to get away from doing a may-have. So that's what I would like, because I need, in short, I would hope that we could provide some sort of, we'll call it subject matter expert from the people that will be paying for this.
Right. So Ashland is one of the first to be going through this process, I believe. So there probably aren't other examples in terms of a cost analysis for the individual elements. I would note that in the case of, for instance, we have a requirement that the face of a building can be 15 feet, of a single family home can be 15 feet back from the property line. The garage has to be 20 foot back. However, if in this scenario, stating that the garage need be recessed further than the face of the house would preclude the case where a garage was 20 feet back and the house was 25 feet back for the front of the house. So when you look at a scenario like that, how does that change the cost basis of the development? It's still the same square footage, it's the design of a building. It may not be a direct cost, but it may be a flexibility question. If there was a large tree in the front yard and they wanted to recess the house further back than the garage, that they'd have to ask for an exception under this modified standard. So perhaps the consultants have a better idea in terms of if there ever were through the technical advisory committee, any kind of cost assessment of the differences. I just think that might be very difficult to obtain because it's likely a project by project assessment.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, Mayor, and I appreciate that, Brandon. I do. I still, I guess, stand by the fact that I'm underqualified to make that decision from a council feedback. So I would at least appreciate a group of developers taking a crack at it and saying, I mean, they would have the experience. They can either say, I don't know, it would be a wash, it needs to be an individual case basis, or yeah, this particular may have is just on net going to cost more money. That is what I would need to be able to make an informed decision.
Councilor Hanson.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you very much. I understand concept one, and I understand what the effect of previous decisions have had on my living experience in neighborhoods where you drive into your garage, you go in your house, you don't see your neighbors, you leave out of your garage. So in terms of like social engineering, I appreciate the attempt to try to bring us together and get more eyeballs on the street and have more egress and regress be collaborative, if you will, whatever kind of label we can put on that. My question really is to concept 2, and
So we're on concept 1 at this point. We will move to concept 2, but we need to give feedback, and I think we probably need to take it one at a time.
I guess I'll save it then, because I thought we were done moving on.
Well, we need to wrap it up and see what the feedback actually is. So there was a suggestion that the council consider just simply not doing any of these updates. And so the first question I have for folks is there interest in simply refusing to make the updates that the state is requiring us to make? Councilor Hanson.
I'll go first. Yeah, no, absolutely not. No, I think that we are in an evolving landscape, and as a builder and construction person, I know that, I feel that the biggest cost affecting choices are not these decisions. They're materials and they're site dependent. So no, I don't, this doesn't scare me at all. This is just part of our evolutionary code, in my opinion.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't want to go against what is legal and what we're supposed to adhere to. I do have a question, and I have to echo what was mentioned earlier. I am not an authoritarian on this, so the more information I could have, the better. I look forward to having the green and the yellow and the highlights of the must and the must nots. And I don't want to sound terrible, but some people don't want to see their neighbor. And some people don't feel secure with all the windows down on the level of street level for people to look inside their homes or whatever. So, and some of the things that were brought up from my colleagues earlier, like, do we need to do this? What is the purpose, and who are we to tell people how they can or cannot develop their home? That said, Ashland really doesn't have that much development. And I am one to want to get to yes and welcome developers into Ashland and annex additional property and get things built. So I am interested to see the haves and the have-nots. I don't want to go against things that are legally we are committed to do. And I look forward to seeing more information. And that being said, and seeing more information, is there going to be additional costs added to this? Because I read in the packet, we asked for additional information on another topic, and it cost us $11,000 more dollars.
So let me just pause, if you will.
Is this going to come from our staff?
This question that we're asking right now is whether there is interest in not doing any updates to the state. And I'm hearing no.
Mayor, can I speak to that
No.
really quick?
Yes.
I think that I'm pretty obliged to tell you guys that, one of the oaths of your office is to uphold the laws of the state of Oregon. So I would strongly advise against, especially even just openly discussing, let's just violate the law. Even if we did, home rule only goes so far, so the Oregon law is going to dictate the code anyway. If we're in conflict with it, I understand your concern, but our rules aren't going to trump the Oregon laws. If every city has to do this, that's going to be how it is.
Noted, and I appreciate that. Councilor Dale, are you interested?
I was just going to say with respect to must-haves, I think the law is clear.
Okay, so that handles that question. The must-haves are, we'll carry on as we have been doing, where we put those into the must-have bucket. And now what we're looking at is the possibilities. So let's go back to we're at the window question, the transparency question. Do we want to direct staff to move forward with additional transparency standards that promote eyes on the street and engaging design? That's the question that we're going to go around here very quickly and answer. My question about this is, you mentioned that there's some energy efficiency elements, and I know depending on the orientation of a house, you want more or less windows. And I would be hesitant to tell anybody this is how many windows you have, because I would much rather have the energy efficiency reality dictate where those windows are and where they are not. So can you speak to the energy efficiency question?
This is also an area where I'm not an expert, but it is something that was raised by Planning Commission. No developers raised this concern with us, but I just wanted it to be something for council to be aware of. I think it's something that we could definitely do additional research into and look at. I think mostly what I have found is the way that the standard is currently phrased as minimum visible transmittance. So one thing that the council and city could consider is a lower visible transmittance would actually stop some of that heat from coming through the window. And so, for example, LEED standards could be as low as, let's say, 0.4, as opposed to what's in the draft discussion before you, which is 0.6. So that would be a lower level of visible transmittance, which would then let less of that sunlight and heat in and maintain some of the energy efficiency benefits while still having that eyes on the street aspect of transparency. So that would be one consideration.
But those windows would be more expensive, correct? Higher LEED standards?
No, I don't know. We would have to look into that for you.
Yeah, I think lowering the visible transmittance is one way to make it less likely that those windows are more costly to include. So I would say in general, and when we've talked about this with developers on other projects, not in Ashland, that it's not necessarily that meeting the window standard means they're going to have a less energy efficient building. It does mean that on some buildings, on some facades, it may require them to make other changes to compensate for the extra windows that are on the facade than they would have otherwise ideally had, which may then be slightly more costly. So I would think about it that way. I don't think it's in direct conflict with any goals around energy efficiency. Just think it has the potential to increase costs.
So are there any final questions on the transparency element? Okay, let's go around and see what folks are thinking. Would we like staff to add transparency standards to this, in this nice to have? And whoever would like to go first can. Councillor Dale?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I think just kind of in the interest of kind of speed and expediency relative to this, my opinion is going to be I'm not interested in moving forward with any may-haves until I have more information costing affordability relative to developers. So I understand, but I need to understand cost-benefit analysis from developers before I can attest to any or ask to move forward with any may-haves.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Bloom.
No.
Councillor Kaplan.
I mean, I feel in the same position as Councillor Dale, trying to understand what's the impact of, this is a suggestion for 15%. 15% doesn't seem very high, but I have no idea whether that, is feasible in all cases. In some cases is not even desirable because there just would be too much glaring sun going into that, depending on the position of the building on the property. So to me, it's directed much more by position of the position of the building on the property is more important than whether it's got 15% or 30% or 5% transparent.
Councillor Duquesne?
No.
Councillor
Thanks. I think missing in this discussion so far is staff's input. I'm totally open to it, but I'm just curious what our colleagues here recommend.
So
in terms of the nice to haves.
Sure. In terms of this transparency related specifically to single-family residential and existing single-family zones, that is not a design standard that we've ever applied. And I think we typically do get properties that have orientation to the street and windows facing the street. So I think there is a question in terms of, is the market already providing that?
Yeah.
We also have in our historic districts compatibility with historic buildings, and those typically exceed a 15% windows on the front facade. So what I don't know is whether there are unique or unusual circumstances that would preclude it, that would require an exception process. And just to be very forthright, I'm a little nervous of an exceptions process on something that typically only requires a building permit. The exception process Derek mentioned are when we do site design reviews through the planning approval process, in which case it would be very straightforward to incorporate that into a planning action as part of the review. It really is those single-family home on a single lot being built anew.
Well, I see this design standard happening as a voluntary, nice to have already. So I'm not interested in pushing it if it's not already in our code. If it's a nice to have, why push it? We're already doing it voluntarily.
Yeah. So that would be the direction back to staff, is to not add transparency standards, promoting eyes on the street and engaging design. Yes. Okay. So let's move on to the garage question, concept 2. Are there any additional questions regarding this part of the presentation? Councilor Hansen.
Yeah. Thank you. When I look at newer developments in Ashland, I'm seeing lots of alleyways. And I'm curious for our consultants as well as our staff. It seems as though we're adding more blacktop in addressing something, and I'm not quite sure if you can speak to this, but if you could help us understand, is that part of this concept 2 that's happening, or is that just something that's like more market-based that's happening? Like I said, I'm living in a neighborhood where people came in and out of their garages, never saw each other. It was weird. So I'm glad that we're getting away from that. But how does this amendment to the code kind of live within what's already happening out there, like in Beach Street, like in this new Clay Street development that we just approved that have alleyways?
So the alleyways you're seeing are actually a result of existing requirements for the subdivision design standards, that they provide alleys for vehicular access off of an alley. It doesn't increase the amount of blacktop. It actually reduces the number of individual driveways off of the main street and reduces the conflict points between pedestrians and cyclists using the road, and makes
Cool.
roads
I didn't know that.
more efficient in that regard than cars backing out into a roadway. That said, this would apply the proposed amendments to cases where an existing vacant lot within a existing neighborhood is looking at building and does not have alley access already. Where alley access is already existing, new development triggers the access for vehicular access to be off of that alley. So that portion is maybe one of those sections of code that Ashland has that was forward thinking in this walkability design standards for going on 30 years now. But I do think that the consultants could speak more to really how this would impact developments that aren't otherwise subject to new subdivision standards or not already on an existing alley throughout the city.
And my second question, thank you for that, and I'll look forward to the consultant's input. But is a garage required in a single-family residence?
Parking is not required, nor is a garage required.
Okay, thank you.
So my question is, when I read the must-haves, I see that garages are already going to be required to be set back from the front facade. So if we're looking at a home that has 3+ contiguous garage entrances, the question is, do we want those set back further than that standard setback in the second bullet? Is that what the question is?
Yes, that is correct. And also to clarify, the wording of that middle bullet is a little confusing. So the must-have would be not allowing garages to be set in front of a building facade. So the must-have is to have them flush with the facade. It's actually a nice-to-have to require the garage to be set back further from the front facade. So that's a nice-to-have. Apologies for that confusion. But yes, it's if a third or fourth car garage would be set back an additional 2 to 5 feet from the garage, the primary 2-car garage there.
And a follow-up question to our staff: how many houses are we seeing that have more than 3 garage entrances?
I've probably seen 3 or 4 in 30 years.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are there any additional questions? Okay, so we will go around. Maybe we'll start on this side if we can. Are you interested in directing staff to provide additional standards to require 3+ contiguous garage entrances to be set back? And we can start anywhere we want, if you're okay to start on your side.
Yeah, I can start. I don't really see the advantage, and especially given it's such a low frequency.
Councillor Duquesne? No? Councillor Kaplan?
Yeah, no, that doesn't seem necessary.
Bloom?
No.
Dale?
No.
Okay, so the direction to staff is to not provide additional standards regarding 3+ contiguous garage entrances to be set back. And then we can move on to concept 3.
Are we, just to clarify, in terms of the nice to have of requiring the garages to be further set back from the front facade versus flush, I'd like to just clarify council's input on that question.
Okay, so if we so then the question takes us back to, do we want to go a step further than the requirements for regular, less than 3+ garage
Yeah,
entrances?
so for an example, if you had a one-car garage attached to a house, does that one-car garage face, is it allowed to be flush with the house, which is the minimum necessary under the new state rules, or does it have to be set back 5 feet or some dimension from the face of the house in order to create that subordinate presence on the street side?
Okay, and our current code does not require.
The current code indicates that the house can be as close as 15, the garage can be as close as 20. So the pattern of development is typically to maximize the front yard setback by building the house to 15 feet from the property line, and the garage can't be closer than 20. But that doesn't preclude somebody from putting the entire house and garage at 20 feet flush with one another, or changing the offset and putting the garage forward and the house further back. So this code amendment would stipulate a relationship between the face of the house and the garage face.
And the reasoning behind this from a walkability space is to reduce the feel of the garage space. Maybe back to what Councillor Hanson was saying about what it is to be in a neighborhood where the car is the prominent element. Can you just speak a little bit more to, I mean, this has come from somewhere, right? This question about a potential setback being better than flush.
That's exactly right, and I think the consultants could speak to the tax review of the rules, but in Ashland, our standards having that distinction between a greater allowance to build the building closer to the street, it goes further and says a porch can be as close as 8 feet from the front property line. Again, moving more of those pedestrian-oriented uses up to the street, the eyes on the street, and recessing the garage further back has another advantage of having that 20-foot setback, which means there's room to park a car in front of your garage without overextending into the sidewalk. So it's worked in part with subdivisions to create the garage further back, but again, it's not technically required. Somebody could, on a larger lot, could put it all in such a configuration that the garage is the most dominant feature.
Great. Councillor Boone.
Yeah, I was just going to say, my understanding is what we were kind of giving direction on or going around the horn on was, are we not adding anything and we're just keeping the bare minimum that is required by the state, or are we then moving to a conversation of this option and what that might look like? So for me, you know, if we're staying consistent with that, the bare minimum that is being required of us from the code, and then that kind of settles the secondary conversation.
What we are doing here, we've already determined that we are going to do the must-haves. We answered the initial question that was on the earlier slide, and now what we're answering is the secondary question, which is, do we want to go a little bit further with the typical single-family homes that we see in Ashland? Do we want them to actually have a recessed garage in terms of this livability, walkability space? My last question in all of this is, this feels like a design element where it's not limiting the amount of square footage. So what would we anticipate the cost differential would be? Would there be one? It would be the same amount of materials. If someone's designing their own house, it would simply be a requirement that the designer would work around, correct?
Yeah, I can't speak for developers or designers, but I could envision a case where the flexibility in terms of site planning was constrained by our setback requirements if they were to change. And if pushing the garage forward allow them to avoid a steep slope in the back. And if you had to set it back further, that might trigger a retaining wall or something else. So again, I think it's a site-by-site assessment. I think your initial point that it's the same square footage of building, same construction costs on a flat lot, all things being equal, I don't think it would have a cost impact one way or the other.
But they could get an exception if that was going to push them back into a retaining wall situation? Okay. All right. Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah, no, I thanks, Brandon. I appreciate the way our code is designed. I'm not really interested in changing it. I don't think the benefit is worth is worth it.
Agree. Okay, so let me make sure I know who I've gotten.
Agree.
We haven't started around that horn yet. That's what's happening. That's why we're a little bit off. So yes, so the answer, what we're answering is the question of, are we interested in setting back standard single-family homes, the garages back a little bit from the front of the house? Councilor Dale?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not interested in Brandon, kind of to your point. I think that it occurs to me that maximum flexibility equals maximum potential cost savings. If a developer needs to move on the fly, then they're not restricted by that. So I would prefer minimum restrictions.
Councilor Duquesne?
I agree. I think the flexibility should be there, and I agree, minimum restrictions allow people to do what they want. So.
Councilor Hansen?
I too am of the no additional recess required camp.
Yeah, and I would just add that if the level, if both sides being at the same setback from the street was not in the city, in the codes coming from the state, I would want us to do that, because it really does have a huge impact on the way a neighborhood feels if you're walking down garage to garage to garage. So that is the direction from the council, that we are not looking for additional garage recesses from the front facade. Does that give you what you need, Brandon, for that section?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Now we'll move on to concept 3.
Great, thank you so much. So completely different context now. This is looking at ground floor residential uses. So as residential units on the ground floor are developed close to the street, fronting the street, in the absence of some more specific design standards, those can sometimes result in less than optimal streetscapes to walk by. So the code audit found the potential for the city to enhance its basic or detailed site overlay standards with some additional design standards, trying to mitigate that. So these are nice to haves, and note that we've definitely heard council's priorities here related to nice to haves versus must to haves. But to have a discussion in this different context of more high density zones throughout the city, looking at buildings being built with these ground floor residential uses, I want to present some of the concepts around design standards that the city could consider. So those are frequently cities will look at requiring active uses or commercial on the ground floor, but the model code has put forward an alternative way of activating the street, which would be having individual entries onto that street. So rather than one shared entry, which in this picture would be off around the corner on the main entry side, just one shared entry for all units. The city could look at design standards requiring more frequent entries for individual units. Again, looking at transparency and some transition from the public to the private realm. So it's the basic concept to look at. And I will note that I know that council has had extensive discussion around the climate-friendly area overlay and looking at commercial-ready spaces. And so there would definitely be exceptions related to that, so that the commercial-ready spaces would not be required to meet these types of design standards focused on ground floor residential uses. So what does that look like? Breaking this down into its parts, first it would be requiring a minimum of 50% of dwelling units on the ground floor to have a main entrance that could be directly accessed. So there'd be individual entries versus one shared entry. So those individual entries, there's people coming and going, it's activating, and then really people then begin to take ownership of that space in front of their unit. So related to that then, is the transition from public to private realm. So thinking both about how people would use the building that live in it, and also how people experience the building as they're walking by it. So the draft discussion code that you have has a requirement for buildings to be set back a minimum of 5 to 10 feet from the street lot line. Now within that 5 to 10 feet, they would be required to provide a minimum of 2 different design treatments, such as a canopy tree, an open space or patio, a low wall or fence, some landscaping. Those types of elements would make a transition from the public realm to the private realm and create some space and privacy, while also really creating a much more engaging and walkable public realm. So I'll pause there. That's the concept. I want to see if people have any questions about the concept and see if it's if we'd like to discuss the nice to haves options here.
Okay, so questions about this element. Councillor Dale?
Thank you. Just a point of clarification, just so I'm clear, this entire concept falls under may and not must?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Kaplan?
Yeah, I'd like some clarification of your comment about the ground floor commercial ready, that you said this would not apply to it. It seems like commercial ready by definition means that it faces the street. Is that correct? Is that why it doesn't apply to it? Because you don't have to have an additional regulation for the residents because the commercial ready necessarily requires an entrance to the street. Is that correct?
I think.
Well, do you want me to?
I was going to say that part of the discussions that we've had with the consultants regarding this aspect is that a commercial ready space is intended to have the ability to convert from residential back to commercial, and you may have one common entry to multiple commercial uses on the interior that are facing the street. And the concern being that if you were having a requirement that 50% of the residential uses on the ground floor have their own entrance, you may compromise the commercial site review component by really establishing it more like a brownstone pattern where each individual residential unit has its own entrance, which is totally appropriate for multifamily and other uses, just may be a concern in terms of commercial ready within a area that is looking to convert back to commercial at some point.
And so is that what the exceptions for commercial ready spaces would be, is to avoid that compromising the potential future commercial use of that property? That's why we wouldn't apply this to that?
That was the intent.
Yeah. Councillor Kaplan?
So that's in the CFA overlay. What about in the C1D district that we've been talking about? Downtown.
I think we'd look, if this was, again, as the May that was, there was interested in proceeding with it, would look to any commercial ready space that was required for that adaptable reuse, including the downtown.
So I appreciate the need to have the gradation between private and public space. It's something that we know from years of watching why public housing has failed, is that it failed in large part because it didn't provide that gradation. People went from direct public spaces into private spaces with no transition space. And that socially, that causes a huge problem for people who are trying to live there and how they feel about it. I wonder if you could go to the next, well, I see on this picture, that's a very barren picture, right? The first one is very barren, and you can see it feels very industrial. When you go to the second one, that feels very welcoming and open, but I wonder if there is some place in between where, rather than requiring that there be entrances there, that we actually require some sort of a landscape setback. Is that a possibility? Because it feels to me that having all of those entrances on the street, I don't see how that doesn't raise the cost pretty significantly. That to me seems like a much more complicated design. But I wonder if there's a way to deal with that and also create a little bit of that public to private space without requiring that they have the actual entrances on that space. So maybe those folks are still coming in through a shared interior corridor, but they're not sitting right on top of the sidewalk in terms of their private space. So that's a question. Is that something, is that
Doable.
a possibility that makes any sense at all? And it's okay if it doesn't.
Yeah, I think it could make some sense. I think it does create, sort of soften the edge of that and may make that feel more attractive to walk by. The downside to that, and one of the reasons that often these two kinds of standards are linked together in terms of requiring the entry open onto the street and require some design attention to how that facade looks and everything, is that if you don't have those entries open onto that space between the building and the street, it sort of becomes a bit of a no man's land in the development, and often then the landscaping may be well kept up, but it doesn't have that same impact as when someone uses that as their own patio or their own porch or their own stoop, and that creates a much more interesting streetscape than it is if it's simply just some landscaping that may or may not be maintained that well. So there's certainly, I think, a qualitative difference between having entries facing the street, and there's, in terms of the ownership of the space, but also just that there is the potential for people coming in and out and to use that space, which I think is what creates that sort of mimics what you get by having a commercial storefront, if that makes sense, is that people generally like walking by commercial storefronts because there's some activity and it's interesting. And when you have entries open onto the street, then people use that space, and that also makes it interesting. So that's the theory behind it, but I think there could be some benefit to having design standards, regardless of whether the entry is required to open onto the street.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. I have to agree what Mayor Graham said, because when I look at the areas that are buildable in Ashland, they are in desperate need of curb appeal, and that does look very industrial. And so to be able to look into what that would look like, picture number 2 is very busy. It's nice. You have the porch there and a lot going on. But as I see the build out in Ashland and the way that looking at Clay Street and so many other properties that are being built look very similar to that, and the areas that are buildable here, to be able to have that recess, to have that curb appeal. We talk about walkable Ashland. People want to look at something pretty. So I think that curb appeal is so much more important. And then having the individual doors in case we have to be commercial ready, that would just kind of take it out of that market. So I I'm just in favor of the one entrance and curb appeal, putting it back and having flowers.
So can you go to the next slide? So the question, this strikes me, is that what are the trade-offs involved in requiring this in terms of its cost? And I've heard that question here several times. It's hard to know unless we have a sense of the magnitude of the difference of that cost. In my mind, there is very real value in having that busyness at the street level, and we are going to see a lot more multi-story development in Ashland in the future, and so we don't want to get this wrong. But it's hard to know if we don't have some sense of how much more expensive does this make that process. So, and I know that you've said that you don't really have a way of answering that, but how can we think about that in terms of that trade-off?
You know, this is, I think, a very good discussion in terms of trying to outline how far the design standards go and applicability to residential on the ground floor. And I think that we can take your comments back, and this isn't the public hearing, so we'll have an opportunity to review and come back. One consideration point in your discussion that I'm hearing is that there may be a distinction from where ground floor residential are abutting a public street, that you see a value in having that entrance be combined with some of the elements identified to be incorporated. So that is, where provided, they shall have the following elements, but not necessarily a requirement to provide those entrances. But again, that's a clarification question for you, not really an answer to your question. So.
but it's helpful. Go ahead.
The only thing I can offer on the cost question, I can't give you sort of put a number on it, the difference, is that when we talk to developers about standards like this, I think there is a bit of two minds about it. I think there are some that see the value created in creating entries that face onto the street. You have private open space that sort of adds value to the project. It's going to be more, it's going to be more attractive units. And so they sort of see the numbers make sense to include this regardless of the additional cost, if there is additional cost. There is some potential for additional cost if these units also need to have an interior access from the interior hallway, depending on how the floor plan is laid out. But yeah, just depends. There are some that would, their preference would be to not be required to have those entries open up onto the street, and have more flexibility with how they lay out the floor plan. So this is more prescriptive. It would impact flexibility for development. We know that for sure. The overall impact on cost is hard to put a number on.
Mm-hmm. Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you. Interesting discussion. I appreciate some of that context you had about the developers, that some would like to see it. And that's where I am. I mean, I look at the first, just to use the example, looking at the first picture and the second picture, and one might want one might the other. I don't really think that it's our responsibility to be adjudicating that. I think that that's something better suited for the market to decide. And, you know, I don't foresee us going in the direction of the first picture, but, you know, if we start looking like East Berlin, I'll be the first to change my mind about this.
So are there any additional questions? Councilor Hansen.
Thank you. Yeah, when I think about future development that this might really impact in our little fair city, I think about the Middle Railroad property that is kind of a continuation of Clear Creek. And then I also think about the Croman development over here and how this might dovetail into new builds. And the way I'm reading this, it's is this a requirement? 50% of the dwellings having that kind of access, and the other 50% being a more commercial oriented?
So it's 50% of the dwelling units on the ground floor that abut the street, and so the 50% number is intended to provide some flexibility where, depending on how the site is laid out, there may be some dwelling units that abut a street, on a portion of a street, but it just doesn't make sense to have an entrance oriented to it, or oriented to the street. So it's not, this requirement applies regardless of what other, let's say if there's a commercial component that's another part of the building, or how many dwelling units are above the ground floor. It's simply just applies as a percentage of the dwelling units that are on the ground floor and that abut a street.
Yeah, I think I can clarify with a numeric. If you had a building, commercial building with the ground floor had 12 residential units.
Yeah.
6 of those units are actually on the street side. 6 units are on the interior and don't have frontage on the street. This proposal would say of those 6 with street frontage, at least 50%, or 3 of them would have to have entrances to the street. So that's quick and dirty as to what it was intended by this section.
Well, that's great. So suppose that one building in those 2 neighborhoods that I just described wanted to be completely commercial, and it was appropriate and it made sense. Would they still have to put in half of the ground floor entrances with this kind of treatment?
This treatment only applies to residential units having a separate entrance. An entire commercial building with no ground floor residential would still be subject to our site design standards and have the commercial entrance oriented to the street. And then if they had a second building, I think was your indication, that had residential in it?
Oh, I was just double checking to make sure that commercial buildings didn't have to account for future residential ready.
They do not.
By having this standard. So this is just for residential ground
proposal to build
floors.
residential on the ground floor.
But in those mixed
facing
use
the street.
neighborhoods. Okay, thank you.
So Brandon, would it be possible, if there was interest in looking at this more closely, would it be possible to get some sense of the cost differential, or get a sense from developers of what this looks like? It may be that in most places they would just do this anyway because of the value. Is there a way for us to get some more of that information in this process?
We can certainly reach out to developers and the stakeholders that they've already talked to see if any of them are willing to provide that type of cost analysis, and also let them know that this issue, were it approved, it would impact your projects, and so that may be an incentive for them to have feedback at the legislative part.
Great. Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks. So, I understand that this is, multi-story buildings in the areas that we've been talking about, climate-friendly areas in the downtown historic district, downtown. And I'm not really interested in leaving up to the market whether they would want to opt for the picture that we saw in the preceding slide, where there is absolutely, essentially, as it described, a dead space. You can walk for 100 feet and it's just bare sidewalk and a set of mostly a non-transparent wall. So I would favor having something like, I don't know exactly the specification of it, but I would prefer to have a requirement like this one, a minimum of 50% of dwelling units in the ground floor abutting street, having these kind of entrances or features of interest. I don't know exactly how it would be worded, but I'm not interested in just leaving it up to the market. I think the market can lead to some pretty awful outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So are there any final questions about this concept number 3? Okay, let's go around. I've heard just now from Councilor Kaplan. Next, whoever would like to go next, Councilor Dale.
Thank you. No, I still think it's minimum. I would like the flexibility.
Councilor.
No.
Councilor Hanson.
Councilor Kaplan, you said yes, correct?
I said yes.
Yeah.
Yes, in some fashion. I don't know exactly the wording, but yes.
Yeah.
Yes, in some fashion.
I'm leaning that way as well. I don't know exactly where to land on it, but
Councillor Duquesne?
Do you know, I have to agree that this is not my expertise, but if we were going to put something down, I don't, like I said earlier, where I look at the buildable lands in Ashland, I don't want to see barren walls. And if I go with the other picture, that is very unattractive and uninviting. And we need curb appeal, so I don't know what that would look like either, Brandon, but I know you'll figure it out because it's much needed, so.
Okay, so the council would direct staff to move forward with working on this. I think we would like some more discussion about what this looks like and what kind of a little bit more information, I think, to help feel like we're solid in making that. Councillor Bloom.
Yeah, just quick clarifying question. It was something that Councillor Duquesne brought up earlier about additional costs. Does this mean you going back and looking into this in some version of this? Are we looking at increased consulting fees?
That is outside the scope. This is a contract between DLCD and the city of Ashland. DLCD and Cascade. So we are not paying their consultancy fees.
Yeah.
If the city were to hire them as a consultant, that would be a new professional services contract, which we have not engaged in.
So I guess the question would be, would you need to enter into such a contract in order to move forward with looking at this?
Well, obviously, we're still working through developing of the final code amendments that we can work with the consultants under the existing contract on that. If there was further analysis required and looking to use consultant services instead of staff to do that, that would be a separate contract.
Okay, thank you.
So Brandon,
Thank
do
you,
you think that you have the information you need? We still have some questions, I think, that we would like to understand better the trade-off, but the council would like to go forward with some way addressing the dwelling units on the ground floor. Does that sound correct, everyone?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We can move on now to the next concept.
Great, thank you. Well, I think this one may be a little more straightforward. So concept 4 is looking at requiring more windows and weather protection for commercial uses. So the code audit found that while the current land use regulations do apply transparency and weather protection standards to commercial uses across your commercial zones, they could go further. So this is a nice to have, not a must have, but I would highlight the current standards in place just so that you're clear on those. So there's a minimum 20% transparency and weather protection is only required over doors. And so we're showing you an image here of a downtown context, but typically also this really becomes an issue in more auto-oriented commercial zones where there could be very long, large building frontages. And then you'd have to imagine in that type of setting, a minimum of 20% transparency and weather protection only over doors. So with that context in mind, the draft discussion amendments that you see in front of you are looking at increasing the requirements for non-residential uses. There's a stair step, there's a 40% transparency in the basic, and I believe 50% in the detailed site overlay. And then looking at requiring weather protection along 50% of the length of the ground level facade. We did take into account and look at, Planning Commission had raised concern about how weather protection requirements would interact with any street tree planting, so we did look at that. So again, this is a nice to have, looking at increasing the transparency and weather protection requirements for non-residential uses in your commercial zones.
Okay, questions? So the current proposal of 40 to 50%, it says, is typical for a smaller city. So we don't have that at this point. We only have the requirements over the entrance ways. Is that correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah.
Well, I think so they're 20 to 50% we're referring to here is the transparency, which is the area of the ground floor.
Oh, that was the transparency. Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, that is more common in terms of a commercial design standard. I'd say transparency is more common. Weather protection is slightly less common, but many cities do also require that. But the degree to which they require it varies quite a bit. When we look at this and we make these recommendations, we're looking at it from the perspective of what are the street facades that we think have resulted in something that is most walkable, and what would be the minimum in order to achieve that most walkable experience. And that's where some of these numbers come from.
Okay. So it appears that we have two questions on this one. One is the transparency, and the second is the weather protection. And currently, what is our transparency? Do we have any transparency requirements?
So 20% requirement.
20%. That's what the Title 18 element was, is 20%. So do we want to increase that, is the question. Yes? On the transparency side?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So any further questions before we go around and answer this question?
I have a question.
Yes, Councilor Kaplan.
So these two pictures are a little confusing to me. This one with the record store, this is not a whole building. It's one unit in a building, whereas the next slide shows a whole building. So does this standard apply to each unit within a building, or is it to the whole building? What is the application of these?
Typically, through a site review, you would look at the entirety of the building. In this case, you could look at this as a business frontage. And I think that it was highlighted to show that between the door and the small window, 1/5 of that frontage is currently transparent, and so would comply with our current standard. The face of this building, the former Gennard Opera House, has windows all the way down Main Street. So obviously that is far in excess of the 20% minimum requirement.
Mm-hmm.
So the one building question is somewhat confusing in the case of a more mini mall type development, where you might see on like Albertsons and the business is fronting in that development facing A Street, where each business is a separate business with a separate entrance. So they would have separate glazing requirements per that site review.
If you can move on to the next slide so that we can recall what we're looking at. So the first question, let's take this question, how much transparency to require? Do we want to increase it from 20% to 40 to 50%? That's the question, correct? Okay. Who would like to answer that question first? We have taken up an earlier transparency question, but this one is about businesses. Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, no, again, for me, I'm not interested in, I mean, obviously that's a much more beautiful building, but I just don't think that it's our purview to be legislating the design of people's development.
Councilor Dale?
No, I'm going to leave this to the developer and the applicant.
Councilor Duquesne?
I'm a no on that. Flexibility, it's not up to us to.
Councilor Hanson?
I too am just with the minimum requirements on this one.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little between the two. I'd rather have a little bit more than 20%, but maybe 40 or 50% is maybe high. So I guess I would opt for maybe 33%, a third of it, rather than just 20%, a fifth of it, and or 40 or 50.
It sounds like a couple of the councilors are simply not interested in changing it. Are either of the other councilors interested in going some part way up?
I am. I know that this is a more move towards a modern look. I mean, I believe this is Central Point that we're looking at. I like that building. I can see the advantages to it, but I also think it's building dependent, and I don't want to
I mean, I know we legislate a lot of design standards, but this one I can go either way on. I'm sure I could land somewhere in the middle. That would be just fine.
Okay. Well, it doesn't seem that we have the support for somewhere in the middle, so it looks to me that the direction is to not include those standards, increasing the standards for transparency in commercial spaces. Does that sound correct? Yes. And then the last question in front of us on this slide is how much weather protection to require. Are there any final questions? So one of the things that I think about here is the fact that our summers are changing significantly in terms of heat and in terms of heat island impacts, and that shade has a different role to play maybe now than it used to have. And so do we have any information about the role of this kind of requirement in making commercial spaces, like say our downtown space, more friendly in terms of when we're having heat in July and August and September? Do we have any way of assessing that?
I don't believe we do. I would note that the downtown not being subject to redevelopment wouldn't necessarily be impacted by a new code requirement for weather protection, as they'd not be subject to that without going through a land use application. Derek, did you have a thought?
I mean, the only thing I would add is we do have a coverage requirement in our code. It doesn't specify a depth or what percentage of the frontage. It talks primarily about entries. So very often you'll see a covered entry like on the ComDev building down on Windburn, where if it rains, you're going to have a cluster of people waiting out that rainstorm. And we've typically looked on development projects around a recessed entry, trying to get at least a 7-foot depth. So I think this standard is calling for 5. In the North Mountain neighborhood, you'll see a standard that calls for more continuous coverage along the streetscape, and that new building on Fair Oaks has tried to meet that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that is with 5-foot depth.
Okay. Any other questions? So the question is, do we want to increase the weather protection, right? It says how much weather protection to require.
Yeah.
But the question is, do we want to increase it from that minimum depth? Okay. Any last questions? Okay, so who would like to go first on the weather protection? Councilor Hanson?
Yeah, I'll go first and say that I'm in favor of increased protection, and I think in these new neighborhoods, I just keep trying to imagine, I think a greater depth would be appreciated in those spaces. So yes, on both accounts.
Councilor Kaplan?
Yeah, I'm on the same page. I think this may actually address one of the things that we were talking about earlier with these just very sterile looking blank walls. If you all of a sudden have some weather protection, it adds some visual interest at a lower cost, and the city has helped fund awnings in businesses at least last year. So yes, I'm in favor of it as well.
Councilor Bloom?
No.
Councilor Dale?
Thank you. Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with the concept at all. I'm just still struggling. I was just reading the draft amendment. I don't until I understand the cost analysis, even though I agree with the concept.
Mm-hmm. Councilor Duquesne?
No, I'm for the flexibility of the builder. No.
So we're in a little bit of a circumstance, because some of the no's are about information that we don't have available to us. It's almost an abstention in a certain way, right? So is there a way to deal with this fact? We are never going to know exactly what the differential in cost is, because these are project by project. And so is there something what would you need, Councilor, to be able to answer this, since we can't get that data?
Well, I guess my question would be, and I appreciate that, Mayor. That's a very valid question. I the consultants had talked about meeting with developers, and I guess I would need to know if the developers said, we have experience with this, we've run into this, this has been our cost. If they say, no, we don't know, then I would be a yes on this. If they say, no, it's a factor of whatever cost, because I just don't have the data in the first place, that's what I'm struggling with. So I guess the question back to staff would be, what would be the mechanism and timeline to be able to obtain that data as part of this contract so that we could make these decisions, given that it sounds like we have time to be able to give you direction that this is not of the essence? What would that look like logistically, Brandon?
I think that we could take the public engagement summary information that Cascadia provides, using the developers that they spoke to that are already oriented to these code changes, and reach back out to them from a staff level and see if they have any inkling in terms of a project performa about how the cost differential would be. I do think that preparing a full project performa for an example project that meets the current requirements and one that meets the proposed requirements is likely beyond the scope of the
And I'll
developers'
stipulate
work.
that, Brandon, absolutely, and I appreciate that. I guess my question would be, is that something, would there be any undue delay in anything that staff needs if we were to request that data so that we could make an informed decision? If there's, that's what I just need to know. Are we screwing things up here?
I don't believe so. I think that we can move forward.
Okay, Mayor, I would appreciate that information so that we could move forward. And I think if this is something where time is not of the essence and council can make the most informed decision, I personally would feel very comfortable with that.
Okay, so do you have that direction, Brandon, that we're interested in moving forward with potentially increasing the weather protection, but we need some additional information about the impact? It's similar to the ground floor entries question. Okay, all right. Now we are back to the presentation.
I think we're done.
The last one.
I think we're done. Yeah, and I just want to thank you all for a really robust and engaging discussion. I think you've given us a ton to think about, which will really make the code much better. And I appreciate all the thoughts and different viewpoints. So thank you for that and for sticking with us for a lengthy discussion. So we will be going to Planning Commission on the 27th of this month and having a similar conversation with them and capturing their thoughts on the discussion draft code amendments. We will continue to review and go back and look at the draft code amendments. I do want to highlight that staff is looking at soliciting feedback, from other different relevant departments, particularly Public Works, as there's a range of code amendment changes here that are relevant to their arenas. So staff's going to help us incorporate that feedback into a revised draft of the code. And we will be, I think this last point, we're going to need to follow up with staff here in terms of how to finalize adoption-ready code amendments and give you all the material that you need for further discussion and looking at these cost considerations.
Great. Councilor Bloom.
Yeah, just real quick, I just want to follow up earlier request that I made that we get what that feedback was from the two interest groups and from developers. It'd be interesting to go through and actually see what language they use and what their concerns were. And then last quick question, what was the bill number that in the legislature that basically created this? I'd be curious to see who sponsored that and who voted yes and no on it.
Sure, it's 066.
That's like a bill.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so this is part of the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities program, which was actually initiated by an executive action by the governor. And so this doesn't actually ladder back up to legislation. And so, this is part of the governor's initiative, and as a result of the executive action, the governor directed the Department of Land Conservation and Development to develop new administrative rules. And so the rules that we're referencing for this presentation are the rules that we are, that's what we're interpreting and applying to the city's code.
Thank you. That's very interesting information.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for joining us this evening and for your presentation and answering our questions. We appreciate the good work of our consultants and our staff, and look forward to the conversation coming back to us with the draft ordinances. We have been sitting here for quite some time. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Councilors, please be back in your seats at 7:56 by that clock. That one. I guess they may be both now, the same number.
I have the restroom. I got 1 minute.
Yeah, exactly. Get it started at 7:55, and whoever's here gets to decide. Okay.
Well, there's not a decision. Any questions?
So we are reconvening. Any counselors who need to return to their chairs? We are reconvened. Okay, Mary Ann. Okay.
Well, good evening.
Hold on just a moment. Jordan, if you can. And if we can shut that back door to keep the noise down. Counselors, we're starting. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. Mary Ann Berry, Finance Director, here to present the third quarter of fiscal year 2025 financial results. We will run through revenues first. So this third quarter is the second year of the biennium of 23-25. We should be at approximately 75% of the budget. However, that's not always comparable across the board. Property taxes, we've collected $13.1 million, which equates to about 94% of the budget. For TLT and food and beverage taxes together, a total of $3.7 million has been collected thus far. That's 53% of the budget. It's lower, of course, because we usually collect that in arrears. Not usually, we do collect that in arrears. And so we will be collecting that right after year end, but before we close our books. Electric user tax, $2.9 million. 75% of the budget, so we're tracking there. Franchise fees, $3.1 million collected, 72% of the budget. And charges for services, that's for all our utilities, water, electric, wastewater, sewer, et cetera, 74% of the budget. And investment income is at $3 million thus far.
Mary Ann, before you move on,
sure.
So just to clarify, the property taxes come in all at once during the year. Primarily, right? That's why we would be at 94%
That's
of the
correct.
budget.
Usually we collect those at around November timeframe, and it comes in at around 90% and then slowly trickles for the rest of the year.
Right. So we're on. We would say we're on track. That's normal that we
This
have
is
the
normal.
94.
That's correct.
And then if we look at the transient lodging, food and beverage taxes, we should, if I understand you correctly, we should be right around 50%. So
That's right.
so we're tracking correctly for that one as well.
That is true. That is correct, because we've collected 2 quarters, 6 months, so 50%.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Yep. Moving on to expenditures, overall operating expenditures. Citywide, we're about 60% of the budget. That's typical as well. We usually do a little, there's some timing issues. We've got some spending adjustments that happen, and I would expect that there'll be some catch up this last quarter. And as well as, moving into the latter or the first part of when we end the year, we usually do some adjustments to push things back into the fiscal year. So 60% is around typical. We've got some upcoming budget supplementals and transfers that will be on your review for tomorrow. These are just typical supplementals and transfers that are to correct the budget between funds and the appropriations that had happened. So as an example, if we spent it out of the general fund, but the budget was in the capital improvement fund, we're going to true up those 2 funds for that. Also upcoming is the fire department will need to do a contingency draw. That is for the overtime and EMS roles. We've been talking about that throughout the year and have been working with Interim Chief Marshal Razor on that, and we'll be coming back to you on June 3rd. An update on our capital spending and debt service. So in our financials, our debt service is not quite where budget is. That's primarily because we have not closed on the WIFIA loan. We expect to close in June for that. And we're at the final stages with all that documentation. As far as the RESP loan, we're trying to push that along as well. The last communication has been May 7th with the USDA folks, and their update on that was that their Roos team, the rural, oh goodness, I can't remember, but it's the Rural Energy Savings Plan team program who is now doing the analysis on considering the parameters that they need in place to agree to the pledge of revenues as security versus what they have been pushing in the last several months, which is a full faith and credit letter of credit and the use of cash reserves, which is something that we have not been wanting to do. We wanted to keep that all intact within the electric fund and pledge our revenues like we do for the water fund. So the city's net position for ending fund balance citywide, we've got an ending fund balance of 89.8 million as of March 31st. And that compared to last year was 87.3 million, same time. General fund is 20 million as compared to last year of 21.4 million. As far as cash and cash equivalents, that's including our investments, citywide is 81.6 million versus 80.5 last year. And then general fund is 19.5 million versus 20.7 million. So healthy fund balance, healthy cash and investments, and we're just now working to prepare for year end and ensure that we continue to stay in budgetary compliance as we end the year. So that I will pause if there's any questions before I go into the next.
Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Marion. My question is the previous slide regarding the WIFIA. It is my experience that myself, and I can't speak for the other counselors, but I have not seen any paperwork from WIFIA that says this is where we are, or the loan itself. Is there any way that we can get any information from them?
Certainly. I think that the...
Can I go online and locate the status?
I'm not sure where Scott has all that information. I can return back to you all as to where that might be located. I will also say, though, that a lot of the information that he has been updating you on has been in the council packet around the rate study and as far as the WIFIA loan, though, goes. Last year, around May, this time, the council was presented the resolution to adopt, which did get adopted, the WIFIA loan agreement, such as it was then. And then, of course, as you all recall, it got referred to the ballot in November, which it got approved by the voters. And so that documentation, I will come back to you on where that is.
And I appreciate
in terms
that.
of sharing it. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I do remember those transactions happening. Just to have a current status, I think would be important.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. So you say here WIFIA loan scheduled to close in mid-June. Could you tell us when you expect the first draw? If it closes in mid-June, that doesn't mean there's a first draw. It doesn't mean we're paying any
That's
interest
correct.
on it.
Right.
When's the expectation of the
If
first
I
draw?
recall, it's fiscal year 2026. I just can't remember the month, and I can always come back to you on that as well. But the first draw, I believe Scott had 6 draws in total, and the first would have been 2026 with I want to say the bulk in 27, 28. So it's a slow roll based on construction, obviously, the pace of construction, and the use also of ending fund balance, and any other funding that he he is currently working on as well.
Follow-up?
Yeah, just follow up. So that suggests that there won't actually be any debt service associated with the WIFIA loan until much later, because we don't start, unlike a loan or unlike a bond, we're not paying until we actually have a draw, and then we only pay on the draw. We don't pay on the full amount.
That is correct.
So
Yep.
that's likely to be in the middle of the biennium, towards the middle of the biennium when we actually start having some
That
debt
is
service.
correct.
Councillor Hanson.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. To piggyback on that, I remember Scott Fleury saying that we're going to do site prep out of pocket this summer, and then after the loan is secure, then we would look at draws in 26. Is that what you remember as well? Yeah.
That's
thank
right.
you.
Great. Okay. So I wanted to come back to you to first apologize, because I did find that in reviewing the reserve fund specifics once again, I was under the impression that there were no other resolutions outside of the 2023-09 resolution that we had passed last biennium, but there are. And in reviewing them, I had lobbed it over to our legal department to do a more in-depth review so that he can provide that to you in terms of what will be coming forward in the budget process when you go to potentially adopt the budget. So I will flip it over to City Attorney Johan Butella to discuss that.
Thanks, Marianne. So I did send out an email kind of analyzing it. I hope you all got it. Just basically, any which way you slice it, there is an additional step that this council would have to take in order to draw from the reserve funds for the childcare thing. I think I put it as the first option, which is finding a dedicated revenue stream. I say it's the most straightforward. Obviously, it's not a very easy one, because that's what we're trying to do for all these other things. I think in my mind that equates something like a fee, but that's for you guys to figure out. But essentially, the resolution is still in place, and it requires, if you want to draw from the reserve fund for an important project, or program, which this obviously is very important, you need to dedicate a revenue stream that's going to be over the next year or 2 years. So unfortunately, the way that it was outlined by the Citizen Budget Committee, I don't think is permissible under the resolutions that we have. I gave a couple alternatives, but they again would require council action. One would be a declaration of an emergency, a welfare emergency that has to be done by the city manager and agreed to by council. And then there also is additional funding requirements that go along with that. It seems as though the resolutions were all drafted in a way to cover an immediate emergency and then have a plan for paying it back. There's a lot of mention of catastrophe or that sort of thing, but there's very little that speaks to allowing it for continuing a great program, but without a straightforward plan. So I don't know if there were any questions as to the email I sent, but I think it kind of laid it all out.
Councillor Kaplan.
Yeah, thanks, Johan. And this dedicated revenue stream is just, so this is not it sounded from, I read the base resolutions as well. It sounds like in this case, this is a specific program for a defined period of time. So the dedicated revenue stream that you're talking about is a dedicated revenue stream just for paying back a short-term allocation.
Correct, yeah. So if you were to draw I think it's like 250,000 for the grant or whatever amount for the grant, then you would need a dedicated revenue stream to repay the
And
fund balance.
what is this? So what level of, you talked about a fee or something. What is this? What is the firmness of a dedicated? How dedicated is it?
I mean, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question, but I would envision something similar to like in the language of the fees that we've previously put forward. the, money that we've collected will go towards funding, the public safety or something of that nature, where it's clearly spelled out by this council in the whatever mechanism you choose that is going to the reserve fund. It's not essentially just general fund money. If that, I'm not entirely sure I know what your question is, so I'm trying to.
No, that's fine. I think you've answered it.
I can add to it. I don't know if it's going to clarify anything, but I think that the resolution specifically says it must be repaid in a dedicated revenue stream in the subsequent years. So I think if the body, staff, were to have a source of revenues to repay that back, that might suffice as the revenue stream.
Yeah.
So, during the CBC, when we were having the discussions, one option was that during the mid-budget cycle review, funds would potentially become available through, cost savings or just things shift during the biennium. And so potentially that might be a possible method to repay it if necessary.
So that's where I was going, is how formal the dedication need to be. Do you need some resolution from council that a first claim on a reassignment of unexpended resources by a certain date? What do you need? It's kind of a strange way that this resolution was drafted to begin with.
I agree with you there. Yeah, I would think that it would have to be enough to cover whatever the withdrawal was in that time period. My concern there is, are you really dedicating it if it's up in the air? Like, we could get this, like you say, the first right. I'd have to do some digging. I'm not sure if there's case law on that. It's not something I could answer off the top of my head, but that would be, in my mind, a little more vague than the statute or the resolution seems to require.
Mm-hmm. So I have a follow-up question, and I know that we have the two different resolutions, and that there's that trickiness there. But the first one, the 2010-18, it includes language that around certain uses, such as appropriations to meet a financial obligation in the coming year. Could this council create an obligation prior to the next fiscal year that we then have to budget for?
That was in the 2010?
Yeah, from your analysis, it appears that was in the 2010, that was some of the, it said it included language that certain uses may include, as approved by the Budget Committee, and one of those was an appropriations to meet a financial obligation in the coming year.
You would still need a dedicated revenue stream.
You still need one. That's in addition to. Okay, that was the clarifying element I needed.
You can, but there's requirements to that. So sorry, the question from city manager was, can she declare an emergency? So in that regard, the emergency would have to be declared and confirmed by the council, and then the funds are limited to the city manager's spending limit, which we have to look at the policy and see exactly what that is. And there's also certain, there are just basically requirements spelling out how the resources are going to be allocated. I mean, in this case, it's one grant for one amount, so that would be fairly straightforward, but I think we'd have to go through the process of, it would be, I guess, a public welfare emergency. We could look at that process, but that's something we could explore.
Councilor Hanson.
Thank you. Yeah, it occurs to me that although this is programmatic and could be ongoing, we're looking at a single fee, a single amount for this biennium. Could we divest of an asset and have that be our dedicated funding stream. I don't know what that would be, but if we had something on our asset list, some piece of property or something that we could speculate that we're going to sell in the next biennium, could we appropriate that future sale to cover it?
Seems like a possibility.
I just wonder
I
if-
don't know enough about the actual inner workings of that to
I don't
see
expect
what's
any
available.
I don't
but-
expect any miracles here, but perhaps if city manager or staff has ideas around that and we could come back to it, I'd like to just put that on the table for exploration.
Councillor Kaplan?
Well,
I didn't.
Oh, yeah,
see.
sorry, I was late into his attorney.
Councillor
Sorry.
Dale then.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yeah, and I appreciate this. This is, I understand the efforts this body is trying to do here, and I appreciate it. I mean, I was worried about it before, and I get the intentions here. This is, I feel like we're just kind of wading into some serious gray area here relative to this, and I'm quite honestly uncomfortable with it. In addition to, I think what probably needs to be a redraft of a resolution that doesn't mean we have to go all the way back through 4. I do think that, how would we handle this relative to if we just, how do we unwind that if council so chooses to do? How do we unwind what the current situation that we find ourselves in? And would it be possible, and I'm trying to figure out how you work the budget committee into this without, maybe you'd have to call them again, I don't know. But if council were to offer an alternate source of funds instead of the reserve fund, as if we were sitting, I mean, it's what we kind of should have done possibly at the budget committee, or if that had been the opposite, what would be the procedure in which we, with this council, if they so choose, would do that?
That's more of a budget question.
Yeah, I would say from public budget law that you can do that. That's one of the reasons why we are bringing this to your attention tonight, so that there's enough time for us to have, potentially that conversation from here at this point. What the CBC has done has added the $235,000 of child care grants to the budget, recommended the use of the reserve fund is the way to fund it. But you as council, it's all under the 10%. So you as council can choose how to fund that $235,000. There are still a number of ways to fund it. And that is the deliberation at this point.
If I may, Mayor, so what's our deadline to figure that out? What would staff need in order for that?
Well, June 3rd is when we are currently looking to adopt the budget. Just needs to be done by June 30th. So we've got June 19th, I think, June 18th and 19th as the next study session, and
June 16th. June 16th.
Okay.
But you couldn't adopt the budget until that happened, correct? I mean, if council so chose to do that, that would happen prior to adopting it? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Councillor Kaplan?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. So, Marianne, obviously I'm looking in the rearview mirror and seeing the third quarter financial statements, and we've got a balance of the contingency of a little over, almost $2.1 million. And I know that you have some, things that we're gonna need to apply that contingency towards. But I'm wondering, standing where we are right now, less than 6 weeks away from the end of the fiscal year, are we going to use the entire $2.1 million that's in the contingency, or is there some flexibility there that we could apply a portion of the contingency for this? And just to go back to remind ourselves of the discussion last week in the budget committee, we already have $100,000 that we could, this council could apply towards it, which is the difference between the expected $1.5 million to be raised by a $5 fee if this body chooses to make that, to approve that fee tomorrow, and the increase that we've given to the Parks Department. So we're somewhat short of.
Right. So To dial it back a little bit, the part of the budget process is that we already take that into consideration when we roll forward, carry forward all those numbers. And the contingency that we left for year-end estimated was already based on what we had anticipated the fire contingencies need was going to be. That carve out was approximately 900,000, I believe. And I'm pulling numbers based on my recollection, but I have a lot of numbers in my head right now. But I'm pretty sure that was 900,000. I believe we're coming really close to that. Chief Razor has another need that sounds pretty emergent, and I think we're going to get really close to that 900,000. The remaining of that has already rolled into the next biennium and been reallocated already into contingency and the budget appropriations. Yep.
I
Follow up, yes.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And I know that there's a lot of moving pieces, and I'm certainly not going to hold you to specific numbers that you know, running around in your head. But it seems to me that there may be some flexibility there. Obviously, you know, some contingency would be rolled forward into the next biennium. One possibility would just be to reduce the beginning contingency right at the beginning of the year. Another possibility would be if Chief Razor has an emergent need that for some additional resources, that could be funded from the reserve. It sounds like it's all of a sudden, you know, it's something that's unexpected, and an emergency might actually fit this one of the other definitions that are outlined in the reserve policy. It just seems like there may be some flexibility on those other ways if we're actually looking to try to solve this problem.
So first, the contingency balance is a requirement per policy. So if you wanted to change that policy, we would have to do a resolution to change that policy. The contingency policy in our financial policy, which I pull up real quick.
Well, while you're pulling that up, Sabrina?
I think, you know, something that council should consider is we provided some options from various items in the budget already. You know, so as Councilor Kaplan mentioned, you know, we may have 100K based on the parks fee. We could take 50K from our homeless funds, knowing that we do have contingency, and things are changing with the building. So we're unsure of how much funding we will need for that. And then 85K from our social service grants, since this is in a similar vein. And that would get us to the number we're looking for. And then we would not need to redo any of our financial policies to make this fit and or take it out of the reserve. Of course, we can always look at those financial policies at a later date, but we're kind of up against a deadline now for that.
And it would make sense, as City Manager Cotta had said, to use the contingency through that methodology of potentially just removing the homeless funds, reallocating it as the childhood care or child care grants, and then when the homeless expenditures, when that need arises, we can draw from contingency at that point. Right now, I wouldn't recommend changing the financial policy, and it is 3%, and our budget is set based on all these policies. And so, as I said, I think we've already set what the contingency draw was going to be for this biennium, knowing that we were going to come back for the fire contingency. Drawing it before we can't take it away from the contingency appropriation. It would have to be a subsequent draw. And I can foresee taking it from a different line item, such as some of those items that City Manager Cotta had recommended, and then using the contingency subsequently for when the need arises. Is that making sense?
And particularly since we don't know what the homeless need in particular is, because we don't know what how many days
That's
will be
right.
required. So if we left some amount in that line item, if we run out of it, then that creates the need to drop back into contingency. Is that
That's right.
correct? But it would make sense then to put some amount in there. We know we'll have some days.
Yeah, I think splitting it, dropping the 200K for the biennium to 100K for homeless services, the 100K from the switch with the parks fee is there, and then pulling 34K from the social services, 35K, that will get us the number that the Citizens Budget Committee recommended. And we would not have to mess with our financial policies to get there.
Questions? Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. So if I heard this correctly, we would take the money and then later reimburse ourselves as needed with contingency funds, right?
We would pull out of contingency if we need it.
Yeah, later on.
Later on.
Yeah. So when I heard the mayor say, when you talked about the homeless and the days, we don't know how many days we're going to need. Is that for the increment weather shelter that we would pay churches or whomever to take care of our unhoused in increment weather, correct?
That's what I'm assuming. The other costs are fixed costs in that program, correct?
Yeah, so the other costs in that line are for the dusted lawn, the infrastructure that we put in place. So we know that cost. What's unknown is the severe weather shelter and what kind of partnership that looks like. And so knowing that, I think we can figure that out at a later date since the child care grant is an immediate need now.
And that would be taking 50K from the unhoused.
50 or 100K. So I think those are your,
50 or 100.
depends on how much you want for social services grants. So it's kind of taking a little from each bucket.
Okay, I get it.
So a follow-up on that, if we took 100 from the homeless budget and we would leave 100 in, we would use that as we needed across the first fiscal year. And then if we needed more than that, either towards the end of the first fiscal year or into the second fiscal year, that's when we would draw on it. And at that point, we would know better what our circumstances are in case there is cost savings in a different place that could be moved, and maybe it doesn't need to be taken out of contingency. Is that what we're thinking?
We tend to know that more towards the end of the second year, but yes.
But that's when we would see this likely, right? Because we had initially put 100 into both years, but then there's that level of uncertainty around how many nights we actually need. Right, so, okay. So is there interest, Councillor Dale?
Oh, just a quick question to follow up on what the mayor said. So Sabrina, I heard you say two things. There was, I believe, you had the 100,000 from parks, and the first time you said 50 out of the 200, I believe, of homeless and 85, and then you said 100 out of homeless and 35. Which one would be more, which one would leave us with better options, to the mayor's point, if we were to have to choose one?
I would leave more in the social service grants. So those are general fund dollars that we pass through to our nonprofit partners like St. Vincent to deal with utility needs and things like that. And so I'm hesitant to take all of that because of that. So I think 100K from homelessness.
And then to the mayor's point, we can see that and
Yeah.
we can. And would you need a motion to do that tonight? Is that how that would
We
work?
just need direction since and that way we can bring it back as directed tonight with the adoption of the budget.
So it appears that what is on in consideration at this point is to, in addition to the 100,000 that will be freed up by the new parks fee, that we would take out 100,000 over the biennium for homeless services and 35,000 over the biennium from social services grant program. So that's the question that will come to all of us as we go around to see if there is interest in directing staff. So please answer that question. Would you like to direct staff to make those changes to the budget and bring those back with the budget process on June 3rd?
Yes.
Yes? Oh, you okay. Councillor Bloom is not participating. Councillor Kaplan?
I guess I'd like to see some more formality around this because I'm not really interested in trading childcare program dollars for homeless dollars. I'd like to see some some language that would lay out the process that we're going to be doing this, almost like a dedicated source of funding for it, as we said with the reserve, because I've heard too many times that we just don't have any resources for our homeless services, and we had a contingency, we've cut short our programs because we've said we've run out of money. So I guess I have some skepticism around the strength of that assurance.
So your answer is?
So my answer is only with clear, dedicated resources, formality of dedicated resources for repaying the money to serve that program.
So I guess to clarify that direction, in my mind, the limit we'd be looking to pull out of contingency is the 100K that we're taking to put towards the child care to meet the needs of the severe weather shelter. So I think as long as I'm understanding the intent of those homeless dollars that we had in the budget, we can definitely clarify that.
Okay. Councillor Duquesne?
I'd like to thank Councillor Kaplan for his question and for the clarity around that. I appreciate it because I don't want to take from one to give to the other. Child care is much needed, and so is homeless care. So how much do we have in the contingency? I know that's after the fact, but how much do we have in there right now?
Because of the budget process, 900,000. And again, that's with an asterisk. I'd have to go back to make sure that that's what we had put down for our the budget process 25-27. That's going to get used. If it's 900,000, I'd say about 800 of it is going to get 830 actually is going to get used for fire.
And that's in this year's contingent, our current fiscal years. Councillor, were you asking about the upcoming budget process and what is the contingency number there?
No, I wanted to know what was happening right now.
Okay.
Goodness. I don't feel good about this.
Councillor Hanson?
Don't feel good about it.
I like the way this is shaping up and the reasoning behind it, so I'm going to say yes. And I'd also really like to know if there's any kind of surplus property or anything on the list that's an opportunity for us to use as a dedicated funding source to repay the contingency. So Plan A with 100 from parks, 100 from homeless services to be repaid, and 35 from social services sounds good as a backup or a supplemental. I mean, just let's look under some rocks and see if there's anything else that we could find.
Okay. So Councillor Duquesne?
Thank you, Mayor. So if we take the 35K out, I wonder if there's a way, if this body would feel comfortable flipping that around, 100 parks, 100 from CDBG, and 35 from homeless. I mean, not CDBG, but the sourcing funds that we give to nonprofits. How much do we have there? If we could take the 100K out of there and leave that, pay that back on a contingency, and then take 35 out of the homeless.
It strikes me that when and maybe this is a question you can help me answer, Marianne, is that the threshold for contingency is that there is something that has come up that was not budgeted for. So I wouldn't imagine that we could do that for a grant program because it's up to us how much money we put into there. Is that correct?
Well, it's not up to us. It's up to it was up to us at some point, and then we developed a policy, and so it's 3% is the contingency amount that we must have for all the enterprises and the general fund.
But yes,
but the
to
use
use
of it,
contingency,
yes.
It needs to be like an unplanned
Right.
item. And so our grant programs are planned and a process every year.
So we could not draw on contingency for grant programs.
Correct.
So we can't do that. So that's the answer to that question.
So I think we do have direction from staff, and that is to go forward with the proposal with 100, 100, and 35 from those three elements, as I explained earlier. And then we would like some additional language around what will trigger, I think, the threshold of additional investment from the contingency into homeless services if it is needed. Okay. Councillor Kaplan?
Yes, I have another topic on the financial
Yes.
report.
Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Marianne, I asked a question about the tourism fund and balance in the tourism fund, and we did receive a response. Thank you for the response on that. And I see that Jordan has also given a response that suggests that we do have resources. We have an unexpended balance in the tourism fund right now that would allow us to, if this council chooses to, for example, dedicate some resources to OSF for the marketing work that they're doing, marketing development work that they're doing, and other things. I'd asked the question in the previous council meeting about $100,000 that we'd given previously, and it hasn't obviously fit into one of the 4 strategic priorities so neatly. But it seems to me that we have that resources if we so choose to do that. Is that right, Marianne or Jordan?
Yes.
Yep.
Councillor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. If those resources are available, I would also support moving $100,000 over to OSF.
So what is, did you have a follow-up question, Councillor Kaplan?
I don't think we can do it today, or can we just give
Well,
guidance?
it would be the question of giving direction. Councillor Sabrina?
I think if you could give us direction to give OSF $100,000, we'd like to do it
This fiscal
now,
year.
this
Yes,
fiscal
today.
year.
Yeah,
So if we
that's-
could just get general agreement, we could make that happen
Yep.
sooner than later.
That's the direction I would like to suggest. Thank you.
And Councillor Kaplan, is that $100,000 for the biennium?
Oh, I don't know.
It would be this fiscal year.
This fiscal
right?
year.
Yes, right. We're
It's
talking
out
about
of
this
this
fiscal year, yeah.
This fiscal year, but
This
not
fiscal year.
for next fiscal
That's
year.
right.
Right.
It would be a one-time only for this year. We
year.
wouldn't be looking at
And
next
we'd-
year's
And
budget.
we'd look at, the allocation of the tourism funds next year. We could look at the same thing. If there's an unallocated
Yeah, the
balance.
travel Ashland contract is for 1 year. And so we'll be having this discussion
Right.
again
Yep,
on how
exactly.
we want
So
to
just this year.
allocate funds.
Okay, so what we would be doing is allocating funding currently in this current fiscal year, and then we would be having that conversation
Exactly.
coming up to this time next year.
That's right. That's my intention.
Okay. So we've heard from Councillor Bloom and Councillor Kaplan. Are there any other questions of other councillors? Okay.
Agreed.
Is that agreed? Agreed. Councillor Dale? Okay. So Sabrina, we're directing staff to put $100,000 into directing that to OSF for their marketing efforts. And that brings us to our last topic of the day. And that is to discuss the process by which this council will elect a new person to the council to take the vacant seat. So I understand Councillor Bloom has asked us to put that on. So Councillor, if you can describe your question.
Yeah, thank you for this. So essentially, kind of the
Oh,
reasoning
and,
why.
hold on just a moment.
yeah.
I'm sorry, Marianne, thank you. It's just gotten a little late. Thank you. Councillor Bloom.
Yeah, where's the coffee? No, I just think it's important that it is the council, it is this body that decides the process that we go about deciding who is going to join us up here on the dais. Obviously, there's been processes we've used in the past, and there's no reason not to consider those processes, but I think that it's important that we formalize it up here. In the same vein, I think that it's important for the folks out there that have applied that are going to be having to sit in those seats like Councillor Dale and I had to do a couple of years ago, that they understand what that process is and that it's clear and that there's transparency around it. So my hope was to kind of kick off a conversation. It doesn't need to obviously go too long. It's pretty straightforward. There are a few different methods of doing ranked choice voting. I know Councillor Kaplan has looked into this. I've looked into it. Maybe others have. So yeah, I was hoping that we could kind of kick off some ideas. There's a few different ways. You've got instant runoff voting. Essentially what that is councilors rank the candidates. The lowest vote getters are eliminated in rounds with votes redistributed based on next preference. There's the board account, which is point-based. A lot of people are probably familiar with that one. And essentially, you rank all applicants with points assigned to them. First place, 8 points, second, 7, highest total wins. And then you've got manual runoff, so you vote for one candidate per round. If there's no majority, the lowest candidates are eliminated, or if they didn't receive any votes, you just cross them off, move on to the next group, and you just repeat that until somebody gets 3 votes. And then approval voting, so each counselor votes for as many candidates as they approve of, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And Counselor Kaplan, I think, had an idea that's different from those, and I'll go ahead and.
Well, I don't know how different it is. It's hard to totally grasp each of the alternatives expressed in rapid fire. But there's a method that when we looked at this back in 2022, I guess it was 2023, when we were going to follow a ranked choice voting, and City Manager Lassard was going to run that. I was contacted by a group out of Olympia, Washington, that had some concerns about us doing ranked choice voting in a small group, because we're just a few voters, and there's a chance of ties, not a tie in the outcome necessarily, but a tie in deciding in the successive rounds how you actually eliminate candidates that maybe had similar kinds of outcomes. So that's called the small group ranked choice voting process. That's what it was designed and used in Washington, Olympia, Washington, and I'd like to suggest that as a possibility as well. There's more than anything else, it's a technique for eliminating or handling those kinds of ties in between rounds, getting from round 1 to round 2. And the rounds are not successive rounds of voting, it's successive rounds of elimination, which I think is similar to what you were suggesting, Councillor Bloom, with your instant count.
Manual runoffs.
Manual runoffs.
Yeah, and I was suggesting manual runoffs because it's another way to avoid ties. I mean, we have a situation where it's unlikely to have a tie. There's 5 ballots that are going off, but you could have 2 people voting for candidate A, 2 people voting for candidate B, 1 person voting for candidate C. What happens then is that everybody that didn't get a vote goes away. Then you have another round, and again, then the lowest vote getter is out, and then you ultimately end up with 2 candidates. And so there is an avoidance of having a tie there. Now, the downside is that you are looking at possibly 2 or 3 rounds. It's equally possible that in the first round, somebody gets the majority votes. But I think that it is a helpful way for, not only for us, but I think it also keeps it simple for the audience at home to understand how we're going about doing it, because it is kind of a deliberative, one step at a time process that my hope is that everybody will be comfortable with.
It sounds like the essential difference is that we would have each of us voting multiple times. Each round would be a separate vote, not a separate elimination round.
Correct, yeah. So again, let's just use the example, 2 counselors vote for candidate A, 2 counselors vote for candidate B, 1 votes for candidate C. Everybody that didn't get a vote gets eliminated. The second round goes again, and if there is the eventuality that the vote ends up the same way it did the first time, then the lowest vote getter, the person with the 1 vote, gets eliminated. Then you have the third round where it's just 1 candidate, another candidate, and at that point it's impossible to have a tie.
Councillor Dale?
So if I understand that, Councillor Bloom, the idea behind that second one is to eliminate the potential infinite 2, 2, and 1 going. You'd
For
have
that second, yeah,
one,
that's right.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of options. And I understand the suggestion from staff is to rank all of them and then to do the reverse order of point tallies. And we have a large field of folks, and so I think that also is one of the things that is to be considered here. So, what is there are a lot of options here. For my part, I think if we can get to the point where we are just voting once, and when I say we, I mean all of you. I think that's one of the benefits, and I think that's what staff was looking for too, is to have a single vote that then that whatever that tallying process is, it leads to an answer, and we don't have successive rounds of voting, because successive rounds of voting take a significant amount of time, and the idea is that you would end up with the same result anyway. So what is the most efficient way for us to get to that? Is it ranking every single person in the pool and doing a numerical score, or is it doing a process where where the rounds are calculation rounds until you get down to 2 people, or somebody hits 3 votes?
Yeah.
Councillor Kaplan.
I mean, I like the simplicity and directness of the method that Councillor Bloom suggested. The one case that does not handle is if all 5 of us vote for a different person, then we have no way of breaking that tie.
Yeah, then yeah, and how far do people dig in on that one person, right? Yeah.
Right.
So
yeah. And I think, sorry if I could,
go ahead.
kind of freewheeling here. I think that there is a benefit too of doing, it's essentially like a reverse board account is what you're suggesting. So, yeah. So whoever has the lowest points is the person that gets it. I think there's definitely a benefit, and it might yield that we do get it. It might have higher odds of us getting it on that first round. I think, I was going to say it would be awkward then for the other candidates to realize where they actually ranked, but at the end of the day, it's going to be awkward regardless, right?
So I think, just if I could, Mayor, whether it's 1 round or 5, every time you vote, we have to read it publicly.
Right.
So there's no secret ballots. So I think that's the mayor's point, and like multiple rounds is multiple reading and multiple rounds of pain for candidates potentially.
Yeah, I would really like us to have a single ranked vote that somehow is then calculated, that's worked through by staff, and then we have an answer, just for my part. Councillor Kaplan?
So this small group ranked choice voting would handle that. It would require each of us to rank all eight candidates, 1 through 8, and we could not only rank 7 of them, and we would require, and that would be a control that the staff would have to put in, so that we would actually rank all of them, and then it would just work out. The ties between, and in the elimination rounds, if there were some, it's quite unlikely, but there could be a tie in the elimination round, not in the final vote, of course, would be handled by the lowest average of all of the votes between those 2 candidates to see who gets eliminated and who doesn't get eliminated. And that's how you advance to the next.
Councillor Bloom?
Yeah, I get nervous with that, starting to get into averages, because I feel like what you're going to end up with is not the kind of consensus that, it'll feel like consensus, but really deep down, I don't think that people will be satisfied. I think that this idea of just doing the ranked, at the end of the day, let's say that there is a situation where 2 people have 12 points, and that's the lowest amount of points that there is, then you just have that second round, and that's it.
You do
and
another
that's
round
just done
and break
at
it.
that point.
So does that, go ahead.
So we want to
Sabrina.
go with the recommendation of your top choice is 1 down to 5 numeric score, and then if we end up with a tie for number 1, then we have another round. Okay.
Do you rank all of them, or just your top 5? You rank all of them, right?
You rank all of them. Sorry, 8. You rank all 8.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Does that sound right? Is that what the council wants to do? Councillor Duquesne, a question?
Yes, I just wanted to have that explained to me. So we rank all of them 1 through 5?
1 through 8.
1 through 8, thank you, because I'm thinking 5, but we have 8 people.
Sorry, I don't know where I got 5.
Okay.
8. Yes.
Okay, 1 through 8, okay.
And then if by some chance that point tallying results in a tie, to your point, then it actually comes back, and that's when we would spend the time to do a second round of voting.
So,
Councillor Kaplan?
So the points that you're talking about, that the points are the total points each candidate. So if you've got a situation where 1 candidate was selected first by 3 people, but ranked 8th by the 2 others, that's the situation. Then you have in the ranked choice voting where we rank the first, you would actually the person with who got 3 first choice votes would be the person that's selected. In this case, If they were ranked 8th by 2 others, you could conceivably have somebody else that was not ranked first by anybody and could get selected for council. Is that what we want?
I personally don't. I mean, this to me is the point system is kind of designed when there are multiple slots. The whole idea is to be able to say, if I don't, the whole idea fundamentally behind ranked choice voting in many regards is to be able to say, like we're going to see in 2 years, by the way, because of what the citizens voted for their charter, is if I still have a voice. If my first choice doesn't, then I at least know my second choice. I can vote for that. In this particular case, there is only one seat. So I'm interested in the simple majority of I worry about that. That's my concern. But I'll certainly defer to what this body likes, as long as it is clearly articulated on our website and every single person knows exactly how it's going to work.
Councillor.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of goes back to the benefit of the manual runoff, is that things break, right? I mean, at some point, okay, your preferred person maybe didn't get through. I mean, I think it's highly unlikely that we're going to have 5 different number 1 people. And when you lose your number 1, you're going to go for your number 2. Maybe somebody else had a number 2. And so it can be a drawn out process. I suspect that it won't be, but it is probably the most equitable way to have that consensus, because we all will eventually start shifting who we might, end up going with based on how everybody's voting, because we do want consensus, right? I mean, obviously we want to all work well together, so we're going to want to go that route.
Mayor.
Councillor Kane.
Thank you. I agree with Councillor Bloom. It might be a little bit more drawn out. However, I think it's more equitable, and I agree with Councillor Jeff. Like, what's your last name again? But I agree with Jeff, is that it should be, put on the website, and our constituents need to know that this is how we're doing it. And that might be a little bit more drawn out, but I think it's really effective, and it's equitable, and it's only 8 people. It's not like last time. Come on. I think we'll be good.
So let's just go around and see what folks are what different councilors are interested in doing. Whether you want to do a point, essentially, I think it comes down to: do you want to do a point allocation process, or do you want to do an elimination process? That
makes sense.
Does that make sense? Does everyone understand that difference? Yeah. Okay. So who would like to start? Councillor Dale.
Oh, sorry. I'd like elimination process, please.
Yeah, I mean, simply just to Councillor Kaplan's point of avoiding somebody getting in that 2 people absolutely did not want whatsoever, I think the elimination makes the most sense.
And who else would like to go next? Elimination. Okay.
Well, I mean, elimination is not a ranked choice voting methodology, and the fact that over 70% of Ashlanders in the last election, voted in favor of a statewide, measure to use ranked choice voting, it makes me sad to hear that 3 of us already have said that they would like to pick something that's not ranked choice. I'd rather choose a ranked choice voting methodology. But if the group wants to go with this other, I think there are obviously some advantages, so I could see going for that. But so I could go with that. But I think we're missing an opportunity to really apply a ranked choice voting methodology that has been demonstrated to work in other places.
Councillor Hansen.
I see the obvious advantages of a single round. And also, I am a fan of ranked choice voting. So I will go with the group, but I too would prefer to do some version of rank choice voting.
Councillor Bloom?
Yeah, in fairness, if it wasn't 9 o'clock and we could actually game this out with different scenarios, I think that it would, I might even come to a different conclusion. I'm just, looking at time, and that, we're going to be dealing with this in a couple of weeks. Just trying to get the most simple thing that's straightforward and we can all get behind.
Yeah, Councillor Dale?
Yeah, and just quick, and I just wanted to say I appreciate Councilor Kaplan's insight on this, and certainly something to be said there. I guess, and just my response to that would be, the voters chose it here because in our particular situation, in our city, there will always be multiple candidates just by way of the way our charter works. In this case, it's only one, and I understand that ranked choice can be used for one as well. I just feel like it's it lends itself to the unequivocal voice of the body with one particular slot open, in my opinion.
I'd like to comment. I mean,
Councilor Kaplan.
I was not talking about the city of Ashland measure for the council seats. I was talking about the statewide referendum on ranked choice voting, where over 70% of Ashlanders supported using ranked choice voting for our statewide elections.
I appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
So,
And I also do think that we should decide what do we do if there are 5 votes for 5 different candidates?
so it's 8:55, and we don't actually have the information in front of us to fully move through and game out some of these elements. And so the other piece of this, though, is that we do have another study session before we have a vote. And what I'm wondering, because I would be inclined to go towards a ranked choice, a more specific ranked choice voting as well, but I don't have it gamed out in my head in terms of exactly what that looks like. And so if we would like, we could spend some time, the folks who are really interested in figuring this out could spend some time and clarify what those options are and how they would actually work and where the potential snags are in terms of and how would we get around those snags if they happened. And then this council could confirm a process at the study session ahead of the vote night.
So maybe Dylan.
Sabrina.
Yeah.
So I think, if we want it at the next study session, that's fine. It's already on the look ahead, and staff can go through the instant runoff voting, game it out versus ranked choice voting, and provide some feedback, elimination process.
Yeah, and I think specifically that, and Councilor Kaplan and I think are happy to get together as well and go over a concept for ranked, and then also game out if the council decides, no, we want to do elimination, what the process would be to break a tie if we did happen to all pick one person and there was no overlap, and see what that looks like.
So that would be the question then, Sabrina, is we have a couple of counselors who are very interested in the topic, and could they provide some information to staff to help flesh that out?
Not to do it, so I'm happy to let them do it. I mean, it's really what you guys want.
We appreciate you offering to do it, but it seems that maybe we could rely on our 2 counselors to come forward to us with clearly delineated processes, and then we can choose on Monday night. We can post it on Tuesday, so that people understand if they're watching it from home, there's somewhere they can look online to see what that is.
I think if the counselors could provide just some language to go in a council communication, so we have that documented for the study session, that would be preferred.
Yeah, and I think we could probably get together over the week and weekend and get something very quickly.
Perfect. Okay. Yep. As long as just make sure that we have it by the council packet deadlines. Okay. Thank you all for your good work, Councilor Duquesne.
It's okay, it's late. I just wanted to say quickly before you hit the gavel is to mention what we're going to discuss tomorrow about the 2 Hearts in Guanajuato, our sister city. That I just wanted our constituents, if you're still with us, to know that we're going to have discussion tomorrow about the possibility of having a gift from our city, sister city, Guanajuato. And I'll just leave it like that. We can go into great depth tomorrow.
And so I would just add to that the process, folks will not see that on their agenda. And so the process tomorrow will be to add that agenda item first. And then should council decide to do that, then we will move forward with that conversation. But thank you, Councilor Duquesne. Meeting is adjourned.